Have you ever wondered why we're drawn to certain people and avoid others? Why we keep repeating the same mistakes in relationships? Why we feel angry, sad, or anxious without even knowing why? Sigmund Freud believed the answers aren't found in logic or conscious thought, but deep inside, in the unconscious. That hidden place where repressed memories, childhood desires, and old fears still live. One of Freud's most controversial and fascinating ideas was this. In childhood, every one of us experiences a powerful inner drama, a deep attachment to the parent of the opposite sex, and rivalry with the other. And this emotional conflict shapes the rest of our lives, from our moral compass to who we fall in love with. And if we don't resolve it, it returns in our dreams, in our anxiety, in strange behavior we can't explain. In this video, we'll dive into the full philosophy of Sigmund Freud, and if you manage to watch it till the end, you just might fall asleep. So get comfortable, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and let's begin. Part 1. The Oedipus and Electra complexes. The Oedipus complex stands as one of Sigmund Freud's most provocative and influential contributions to the field of developmental psychology. Drawing its name from the tragic Greek myth in which Oedipus unwittingly kills his father and marries his mother, the theory outlines a set of unconscious emotional struggles that Freud believed all children experience between the ages of 3 and 6. Freud argued that during what he termed the phallic stage of psychosexual development, young boys begin to feel a powerful, instinctual attachment to their mothers, both emotionally and sexually, while simultaneously developing feelings of rivalry and hostility toward their fathers. This inner conflict, impossible to act upon or resolve directly, becomes a defining psychological hurdle that every child must overcome to achieve healthy psychological maturation. Freud regarded the Oedipus complex as the single most critical challenge in early development. He maintained that the resolution of this complex was essential in shaping a child's gender identity, the formation of a moral conscience, and to form emotionally mature relationships in adulthood. Despite being deeply controversial, especially to the rigid moral values of Freud's time, he viewed this theory as central not only to understanding the individual psyche, but also to the functioning of society at large. In boys, the Oedipus complex tends to follow a relatively consistent developmental trajectory. At first, young children feel affection for both parents and may compete with siblings for their attention and love. However, as boys start to recognize anatomical distinctions between the sexes, their emotional focus intensifies toward their mothers. For children of both genders, the mother often becomes the first object of love due to her role as the primary caregiver during early infancy. As this bond deepens, boys begin to develop fantasies of monopolizing their mother's attention and affection, imagining scenarios in which they eliminate their fathers as rivals. Beneath these seemingly harmless declarations lies a web of profound emotional conflict that gives rise to anxiety and distress. The father comes to be seen as both an obstacle and a threat, an imposing figure who stands in the way of the child's deepest desires. The boy's emotions toward his father become conflicted, mixing genuine admiration and affection with jealousy, fear, and resentment. While the father remains a figure of authority, protection, and love, he is simultaneously perceived as a formidable competitor for the mother's affection. This duality creates severe psychological tension. Boys may begin to harbor aggressive thoughts or even fantasies about defeating or removing their fathers, but these are coupled with a deep-seated fear of retribution for such taboo feelings. The father, in the child's imagination, becomes an all-powerful rival capable of severe punishment. This fear of punishment eventually crystallizes into what Freud termed castration anxiety, the belief that the father might retaliate by inflicting the ultimate loss, the removal of the penis. Boys, upon noticing that girls do not possess penises, may conclude that girls have been punished, castrated, for having similar forbidden wishes. This horrifying realization sparks a terror that they, too, might suffer the same fate if they persist in their sexual longing for their mothers. The father is thus envisioned as the enforcer of sexual boundaries, the one with the authority to exact this brutal consequence. The overwhelming fear of castration becomes the primary emotional force that compels the child to resolve the Oedipal conflict. Yet this resolution cannot occur through a simple suppression of desire, as giving up the wish for the mother would bring unbearable feelings of defeat and loss. Instead, a more complex psychological transformation begins to unfold. Boys navigate the Oedipal conflict by identifying with their fathers. When they realize they cannot overcome their fathers, they resolve the tension by aligning with them, aspiring to emulate their behaviors and roles. This identification fulfills several crucial psychological needs that help dissolve the Oedipal tension. By internalizing their father's values, beliefs, and moral expectations, boys begin to construct their superego, the internalized moral compass. They also adopt behaviors and gender roles considered masculine, which aids in the development of a stable sexual identity. Through this process of identification, boys experience a sense of indirect gratification by imagining themselves as participants in the father's exclusive bond with the mother. Additionally, they develop the hope that, in time, they too will have romantic partners who can provide the affection that is currently unavailable from their mothers. This emotional shift requires them to forego immediate desires in favor of long-term fulfillment. As a result, they begin to develop respect for authority, a sense of conscience, and the ability to build meaningful heterosexual relationships in adulthood. When boys are able to work through these conflicts successfully, they establish a solid masculine identity and undergo healthy moral development. A similar psychological dynamic occurs in girls, referred to as the Electra complex, although Freud offered far less attention to female development. At first, girls form a close bond with their mothers, but during the phallic stage, they become aware of their anatomical difference, the absence of a penis. Freud termed the emotional response to this discovery penis envy. This realization often leads to feelings of inferiority and resentment, with girls blaming their mothers for bringing them into the world incomplete. As a result, girls redirect their affection toward their fathers, viewing them as love objects. However, this shift also creates rivalry with their mothers, as girls compete for their father's affection, a dynamic that mirrors the Oedipal conflict in boys. Resolution occurs when girls begin to identify with their mothers and accept traditional feminine roles. In doing so, they prepare themselves to find fulfillment in future relationships with men who embody the masculine traits they feel they lack. Freud argued that girls encounter greater difficulty in resolving the Electra complex. Unlike boys, who are driven by a fear of castration to abandon their forbidden desires and identify with their fathers, girls do not experience such intense fear as they are already castrated in Freud's view. This lack of anxiety reduces the urgency for them to detach from their fathers and form strong identification with their mothers. Consequently, Freud proposed that women tend to develop less rigid superegos and weaker internalized moral standards compared to men. He also claimed that penis envy continues to influence women's psychological development, shaping their relationships with men and their understanding of their own sexuality. These aspects of Freud's theory have drawn substantial criticism from feminist thinkers and contemporary psychologists, many of whom reject the underlying notion of female inferiority. Still, The core insight that children harbor complex emotions toward their parents and that identity formation hinges on the process of identification remains a lasting contribution to psychological theory. Modern theorists have reinterpreted these dynamics through the lens of social learning and power relations, rather than biological determinism. Successfully resolving the Oedipal conflict leads to a number of critical developmental milestones. By identifying with the parent of the same sex, children cultivate a clear gender identity and form a foundation for their future sexual orientation. They absorb moral guidelines, develop a conscience, and acquire the emotional capacity to feel guilt, shame, and to engage in moral reasoning. The superego emerges as an internalized ethical authority, guiding behavior even in the absence of external control. Through this process, children learn to postpone immediate gratification and come to terms with the reality that not all desires can be instantly fulfilled. They also begin to respect rules, authority figures, and social structures, which is essential for integrating into society. Most significantly, children learn how to redirect their instinctual drives, particularly sexual and aggressive impulses, into constructive, socially approved outlets through sublimation. These developmental accomplishments form the bedrock of sound psychological health and enable individuals to establish mature, emotionally fulfilling relationships in adulthood. Failure to successfully resolve the Oedipus complex can give rise to enduring psychological issues that last throughout an individual's life. In some cases, people may remain emotionally fixated on their parent of the opposite sex, making it difficult for them to form deep, fulfilling relationships with others. They might consistently seek romantic partners who resemble that parent or feel perpetually dissatisfied because no relationship lives up to their idealized early bond. Some individuals experience lingering guilt or anxiety surrounding their sexual thoughts and impulses, stemming from unresolved inner conflicts during childhood. This can lead to long-standing difficulties with authority figures, often rooted in unconscious rivalries with the same-sex parent. These unresolved tensions may manifest either as defiance toward authority or, conversely, as excessive submission and dependency on others. When the process of identification is disrupted, whether due to inadequate parental role models or inconsistent guidance, confusion regarding gender identity can emerge. Recognizing these possible consequences became a crucial aspect of psychoanalytic approaches to treating adult psychological disturbances. Freud also saw the Oedipus complex as central to his broader theories about civilization and culture. He believed that the suppression of incestuous urges marked the beginning of moral awareness and social development. The prohibition against incest, in his view, compels individuals to seek sexual and emotional connections outside the family, fostering social bonds and facilitating cultural interaction. The development of the superego, which internalizes the authority of the father figure, plays a key role in passing moral standards from one generation to the next. Freud proposed that the redirection, or sublimation, of sexual and aggressive energies is what fuels human creativity, innovation, and intellectual progress. In his view, the existence of the Oedipus complex is essential to human civilization. Without it, people would lack both ethical discipline and the capacity for communal life. This link between personal psychological growth and the evolution of culture became a defining concept in Freud's later writings on society and anthropology. He regarded the Oedipus complex not only as an individual psychological hurdle, but as the very cornerstone of organized human existence. Part 2. Defense Mechanisms. When the ego struggles to mediate the competing demands of the ID, the superego, and the realities of the external world, it turns to defense mechanisms, unconscious psychological tools designed to shield the conscious mind from intense anxiety. These strategies work by distorting reality or redirecting emotional energy in ways that help maintain emotional balance. Defense mechanisms operate involuntarily and without conscious thought. They play a crucial role in protecting mental stability by preventing psychological disintegration. However, when relied upon excessively, these mechanisms can contribute to mental health issues and interfere with everyday functioning. Sigmund Freud identified a wide array of defense mechanisms that individuals employ to manage both internal tensions and external pressures. Understanding how these mechanisms work became a cornerstone of psychoanalytic therapy, as many psychological symptoms emerge from failed or incomplete attempts at emotional self-protection. Among all defense mechanisms, repression is considered the most basic and foundational. It functions by forcefully pushing distressing memories, traumatic experiences, and socially unacceptable impulses into the unconscious, effectively shielding the conscious mind from their immediate impact. Unlike ordinary forgetting, repression is an active and ongoing psychological process. Although the repressed material remains out of conscious awareness, it continues to exert influence on thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. For instance, someone may have no recollection of a traumatic event from childhood but still experience anxiety in similar situations. While repression serves to protect against emotional overwhelm, it also blocks personal insight and emotional healing. Maintaining repression consumes significant mental energy, often resulting in various psychological symptoms. A key goal in psychoanalytic treatment is to assist individuals in safely accessing and processing these repressed elements, thereby fostering greater emotional integration. Denial is another defense mechanism, one that involves rejecting obvious truths because accepting them would cause psychological discomfort. In contrast to repression, which deals with internal content, denial concerns the external world. It involves refusing to accept facts or realities that contradict one's desires or self-image. For example, a person might ignore a serious health diagnosis despite medical proof, or parents may reject consistent reports from teachers about their child's behavioral issues. Denial acts as a buffer against feelings of helplessness or fear by temporarily removing distressing information from awareness. However, when used persistently, it undermines effective decision-making and adaptive behavior. Individuals who habitually deny problems may avoid seeking medical help or confronting critical personal issues. Though it may offer short-term relief, denial often leads to escalating problems that become harder to manage over time. Projection involves attributing one's own unacceptable feelings, desires, or thoughts to others. For example, someone harboring anger may accuse others of being hostile, or a person experiencing conflicted sexual urges might perceive such intentions in others' innocent actions. Projection allows a person to remain disconnected from thoughts or impulses they find disturbing by imagining that these originate outside themselves. This mechanism can cause significant interpersonal issues as it distorts how people perceive those around them. When individuals act on projected emotions, they often misinterpret others' behavior, creating confusion and conflict in relationships. In extreme cases, projection contributes to paranoid thinking, where aggressive or threatening feelings are imagined as coming from external enemies. In psychoanalysis, helping patients identify and take ownership of their projections is a vital therapeutic goal. Displacement refers to shifting emotional reactions from a threatening or inappropriate target to a more acceptable or safer one. For instance, a person who is angry at their boss may express that anger by lashing out at family members instead. Similarly, a child unable to express frustration toward a parent might direct those feelings toward siblings or pets. By redirecting strong emotions to less risky targets, displacement enables expression without direct confrontation. However, this often leads to harm in personal relationships, as innocent parties bear the brunt of misdirected emotions. Commonly, stress from work or other external sources finds its way into domestic conflicts, weakening family bonds and creating cycles of unresolved tension. Understanding how displacement works can enable individuals to identify the true origins of their emotional responses and approach underlying issues more directly. Displacement also plays a significant role in phobic disorders, where anxiety stemming from internal conflicts is redirected onto specific external objects or situations. Sublimation is often regarded as the most adaptive defense mechanism, as it transforms primitive urges into behaviors that are not only socially acceptable but also constructive. For example, aggressive tendencies may be redirected into pursuits such as competitive sports, military careers, or assertive business strategies. Similarly, sexual energy might be sublimated into artistic expression, scientific inquiry, or humanitarian efforts. Unlike defense mechanisms that rely on avoidance or distortion of reality, sublimation enables individuals to partially satisfy their basic drives while simultaneously promoting both personal growth and societal benefit. Freud theorized that sublimation provides the psychic energy behind humanity's most remarkable achievements in the realms of art, science, and culture. Those who effectively sublimate instinctual impulses often emerge as highly innovative and productive contributors to society. However, successful sublimation demands a strong ego capable of channeling intense emotional drives without severing their emotional vitality. When taken to an extreme, sublimation may lead to overly cerebral or emotionally detached personalities that lack authenticity, spontaneity, and emotional depth. Rationalization involves constructing seemingly logical reasons to justify irrational behaviors or unacceptable urges. People may persuade themselves that selfish or harmful actions are noble or necessary. For instance, a student who fails an exam might blame the teacher's unfair questioning rather than acknowledging a lack of preparation. An individual who mistreats others might rationalize it as being honest or tough. This mechanism allows individuals to preserve a favorable self-image even when their behavior contradicts their professed values. Rationalizations often come in the form of sophisticated arguments that, while convincing on the surface, conceal the true emotional motives beneath. When overused, rationalization can give rise to rigid, overly intellectual personalities that become disconnected from their emotional reality. A key therapeutic goal often involves helping individuals differentiate between intellectually sound explanations and emotionally driven justifications. Regression refers to reverting to earlier stages of psychological development in response to overwhelming stress or fear. In such situations, adults may exhibit childlike behaviors, seeking care or comfort from others. For example, someone diagnosed with a serious illness might become dependent and demanding, mirroring early childhood behaviors. Students facing academic stress might resort to coping mechanisms typical of earlier developmental phases. This defense can serve a temporary protective role by reactivating strategies that once provided a sense of safety and reassurance. While short-term regression during periods of crisis can be a healthy coping response, persistent reliance on regressive behaviors may hinder emotional development and interfere with adult functioning and problem-solving capabilities. Reaction formation occurs when a person adopts attitudes or behaviors that are the direct opposite of their unconscious impulses. For example, someone harboring intense aggressive feelings may become overtly gentle and pacifistic. A person grappling with sexual desires might display prudish or rigidly moral attitudes about sexuality. Parents who feel conflicted or ambivalent toward their children may become excessively protective or intrusive. This mechanism enables individuals to manage threatening inner impulses by adopting an extreme stance in the opposite direction. However, these reactions often appear exaggerated or unnatural because they require continuous psychological effort to suppress the underlying emotions. Individuals employing reaction formation may also become highly critical of others who openly express the very impulses they themselves are repressing. At times, the suppressed feelings may leak through, leading to inconsistent or even contradictory behavior. Isolation of affect is a psychological defense that disconnects emotional responses from thoughts, allowing individuals to recount distressing events without experiencing the emotions typically linked to them. For instance, a person may speak about childhood abuse in a logical, emotionally flat way without showing signs of anger, sadness, or fear. This mechanism shields the conscious mind from emotional overload, making it possible to engage with painful material at a distance. This form of emotional detachment often arises after repeated exposure to trauma, where feeling emotions became too unbearable. While isolation of affect can serve as a short-term buffer, it tends to obstruct emotional resolution and strain interpersonal connections. Individuals who lean heavily on this defense may come across as emotionally unavailable or oddly indifferent, even when talking about deeply personal matters. In therapy, a key objective is to help individuals re-establish contact with the emotions they've separated from their experiences. This doesn't mean eradicating defenses altogether, but rather encouraging more adaptive and flexible use of them. Psychoanalytic theory places strong emphasis on defense mechanisms because they often sustain psychological symptoms at an unconscious level. Clients frequently resist becoming aware of their defenses, as doing so initially raises anxiety. Therapists must interpret these patterns with care, ensuring they don't undermine the defenses too forcefully or prematurely. The Therapeutic Alliance offers a safe space for clients to examine their defensive behaviors and gradually replace them with healthier forms of emotional regulation. Because these defenses play such vital protective roles, altering them typically takes time and patience. Therapy aims to help individuals build a more resilient ego, one that can endure anxiety without automatically resorting to distortions in perception or emotional numbing. Ultimately, the goal is to foster psychological flexibility, enabling people to use defense mechanisms consciously and appropriately rather than rigidly and unconsciously. This transformation in how defenses are understood and utilized represents a crucial milestone in the progress of psychoanalytic treatment. Part 3. Repression and the Return of the Repressed. Repression serves as the foundation of all psychological defense mechanisms. It is the primary method the mind uses to shield itself from intense anxiety. Unlike ordinary forgetting, repression is an active, unconscious process designed to keep disturbing thoughts, memories, or impulses from entering conscious awareness. This mechanism automatically engages whenever potentially traumatic or emotionally overwhelming material threatens the individual's mental stability. Freud uncovered the dynamics of repression through his work with patients who had entirely forgotten traumatic experiences, yet continued to suffer from inexplicable psychological and physical symptoms. The mental energy used to sustain repression does not eliminate the conflict, it merely transforms it into alternative, often puzzling expressions. Understanding repression became central to psychoanalytic theory, as it revealed how unresolved unconscious conflicts can continue to shape a person's thoughts, feelings, and actions, even without their awareness. The roots of repression are typically found in early childhood, when a young person encounters experiences or internal impulses that feel too threatening to process directly. For instance, a child exposed to domestic violence might unconsciously block out those traumatic events in order to maintain emotional stability. Similarly, survivors of childhood sexual abuse often repress memories of the abuse because consciously facing them would evoke unbearable feelings of powerlessness and betrayal. Children may also repress their own unacceptable impulses, such as aggression or sexual curiosity, when those feelings clash with parental expectations or moral teachings. At this developmental stage, the ego is too fragile to fully process or integrate such overwhelming experiences. As a result, repression becomes a necessary psychological defense for survival. However, the repressed material doesn't simply vanish, it continues to exert influence in indirect and often unexpected ways. The unconscious mind operates on principles that differ from those of conscious reasoning. As a result, repressed content frequently resurfaces in symbolic or distorted forms, bypassing rational thought. Clues to this hidden material can often be found in dreams, verbal slips, or seemingly inexplicable behaviors. Repression involves a network of psychological strategies working in tandem to keep threatening content out of conscious thought. For example, selective attention directs focus away from anxiety-provoking stimuli, while selective memory inhibits recall of painful events. Emotional numbing blocks the feelings associated with traumatic experiences from reaching awareness. In addition, cognitive distortions allow the individual to reinterpret distressing events in ways that make them seem less threatening. The ego orchestrates these various tactics to uphold the psychological boundary between the conscious and unconscious mind. However, sustaining this repressive barrier requires continuous mental effort, which can deplete the individual's emotional and creative resources. Those who rely heavily on repression often report feeling emotionally numb or chronically exhausted, as significant energy is spent keeping distressing material submerged. In some cases, unresolved emotional conflicts may even manifest physically as the body expresses what the mind cannot tolerate. Freud's concept of the return of the repressed underscores one of his most profound insights. Even when pushed out of awareness, repressed content retains its vitality and continues to seek expression. Though it may not surface directly, it frequently reappears in disguised, symbolic, or distorted forms. One of the most common outlets for repressed material is through dreams. During sleep, the usual psychological defenses are weakened, making it easier for unconscious material to emerge. Traumatic experiences may appear in nightmares or take symbolic forms that echo the original trauma in a disguised manner. Another example is the phenomenon of Freudian slips, when someone unintentionally says something revealing, such as calling a current partner by an ex-partner's name. These verbal accidents betray hidden thoughts and emotions that remain unacknowledged at the conscious level. Other manifestations of the repressed include parapraxis, or faulty actions, like missing an important meeting or misplacing valuable items. Such behaviors are not entirely random. They often carry unconscious meaning, such as hidden resentment or inner conflict. These apparent mishaps allow repressed impulses to achieve a limited degree of expression, all while preserving the illusion of conscious control. Psychological symptoms frequently emerge as disguised expressions of repressed content resurfacing into awareness. In conversion hysteria, emotional conflicts that have been pushed out of consciousness are transformed into physical symptoms, which act as symbolic representations of those unresolved inner tensions. For example, a woman who has unconsciously buried anger toward her husband might experience paralysis in her hand, preventing her from physically acting on her aggression. At the same time, this allows her to symbolically express hostility without directly acknowledging it. In phobic disorders, repressed fears are often redirected onto objects or situations that feel safer to confront than the original source of anxiety. A person who has suppressed traumatic memories of childhood sexual abuse might develop a fear of enclosed spaces, which symbolically mirror the emotional entrapment they experienced during the abuse. Obsessive-compulsive behaviors can serve as structured, socially acceptable rituals through which repressed urges find indirect expression. For instance, compulsive hand-washing might reflect hidden guilt related to sexual or aggressive impulses, allowing the person to act on these feelings in a sanitized, metaphorical way. These compulsions provide a form of partial relief for the repressed drives, while simultaneously maintaining psychological defenses that prevent full awareness of the underlying conflicts. Repressed experiences can also resurface through repetition compulsion, a psychological mechanism in which individuals unconsciously recreate aspects of past traumas in new contexts. Someone who was emotionally abandoned in childhood may continually enter relationships with partners who ultimately reject them, unknowingly repeating the original wound. Similarly, survivors of early abuse may find themselves repeatedly drawn to abusive partners, not because they seek harm, but because the pattern feels disturbingly familiar. These reenactments serve several psychological purposes. They may reflect unconscious efforts to master the trauma or attempts to elicit the emotions that were originally suppressed. However, because acknowledging these patterns would require facing the painful, repressed material that fuels them, the individual remains unaware of the cycle. Breaking free from repetition compulsion often demands therapeutic exploration and confrontation of the underlying trauma. Without this insight and healing, people remain stuck in self-sabotaging patterns that mirror their early psychological injuries. Understanding repetition compulsion has proven essential to explaining why individuals sometimes undermine their own well-being or success. Creative expression often serves as a socially acceptable outlet for repressed content to re-emerge. Artists, for example, may channel forbidden desires or aggressive impulses into their work without consciously recognizing the inner conflicts driving their creativity. Writers may explore narratives and characters that reflect their own unconscious struggles, safely distanced through fictional settings. Musicians might pour intense, repressed emotion into compositions that resonate deeply with audiences, without realizing the personal psychological roots of their music. This sublimated return of repressed material fulfills both personal and collective roles. It allows individuals to express powerful impulses in a culturally sanctioned manner, and it contributes to the richness of human artistic achievement. According to Freud, many of civilization's most celebrated works of art and literature owe their origin to this creative transformation of unconscious material. Nevertheless, even sublimation cannot fully resolve the tension, as repressed impulses continue seeking more direct forms of expression. The ongoing conflict between repression and its return generates much of the psychological energy that fuels human behavior and mental life. In psychoanalytic therapy, the goal is to help individuals safely recover and integrate repressed experiences into conscious awareness. One key technique, free association, encourages patients to verbalize whatever comes to mind without filtering or judgment, gradually allowing buried content to emerge. Another approach, dream interpretation, offers insights into unconscious material that appears symbolically during sleep. Transference, where patients project early relationship dynamics onto the therapist, provides an opportunity to revisit and work through unresolved childhood conflicts within a safe therapeutic relationship. However, the process of bringing repressed material to the surface must be carefully managed. Premature exposure to traumatic memories can be destabilizing and potentially harmful. For this reason, It is essential that patients possess sufficient ego strength and receive consistent therapeutic support to face and process disturbing content without becoming overwhelmed. Ultimately, the purpose of psychoanalysis is not merely to expose unconscious material, but to foster healthier, more adaptive strategies for managing inner conflict. Effective therapy helps individuals recognize the ways in which repressed material continues to shape their current behavior and relationships, enabling them to break free from destructive patterns and move towards psychological integration and growth. Repression and the reemergence of repressed material are not only central to individual psychology, but also offer valuable perspectives on social and cultural dynamics. According to Freud, the advancement of civilization depends on the collective suppression of primal drives, which fosters social order but simultaneously generates persistent inner conflicts. Social prohibitions, particularly those targeting aggression and uninhibited sexuality, are essential for maintaining cohesion, yet they demand continuous psychological effort to uphold. When these societal mechanisms weaken or collapse, the suppressed content may erupt in the form of widespread upheaval, such as war, revolution, or mass violence. Cultural expressions, including literature, visual arts, and popular media, often serve as permissible avenues through which these repressed drives can surface in metaphorical or symbolic ways. Recognizing how these mechanisms operate sheds light on both the emergence of individual psychological disorders and the sudden rise of collective social movements. In this way, the frameworks of repression and its return offer profound insights into personal development and the structural underpinnings of societies. These concepts remain influential across contemporary fields such as psychology, sociology, and cultural studies, even among scholars who critique or reject other components of Freudian thought. Part 4. Free Association and the Psychoanalytic Method. Free association stands as the cornerstone of psychoanalytic therapy and is widely considered Freud's most significant innovation in clinical technique. This approach evolved from his initial work with hypnosis, during which he observed that patients could access hidden, unconscious material through spontaneous and unfiltered verbal expression in a relaxed state. The essential instruction of free association is deceptively simple. Patients are encouraged to verbalize whatever thoughts arise without attempting to structure, censor, or evaluate them. This deliberate abandonment of logical order and self-monitoring creates a unique mental environment, one in which everyday defenses are lowered and unconscious thoughts can slowly rise to the surface. Freud maintained that the psyche, when unimpeded, gravitates toward deeper psychological truths, making free association a primary route to uncovering repressed memories and internal conflicts. However, the technique is not without challenges. It demands a high level of engagement and sensitivity from both the patient and the analyst, as resistance frequently emerges when emotionally charged or distressing material nears conscious awareness. The theoretical underpinnings of free association are rooted in Freud's concept of psychic determinism. He argued that even seemingly random or nonsensical thoughts are guided by unconscious mental forces. When a patient adheres to the core rule of saying whatever comes to mind, these utterances often expose hidden connections among thoughts, emotions, and recollections. The order in which associations occur offers insight into unresolved internal struggles and the defense mechanisms employed to keep them buried. Sudden shifts in topic or seemingly illogical connections often reflect deeper unconscious links that would remain undetected in ordinary dialogue. The psychoanalyst's role is to detect patterns and symbolic meanings within the patient's associations, clues that point to past developmental challenges or suppressed conflicts. This interpretive process is complex and gradual, as unconscious material tends to emerge through indirect and fragmented channels. Meaning becomes discernible only over time, as recurring themes and associative networks take shape across multiple sessions. The physical and procedural setting of psychoanalysis is carefully designed to support the free associative process. Traditionally, patients recline on a couch with the analyst seated behind them and out of sight. This configuration minimizes visual stimulation and social cues that might otherwise inhibit open expression. The posture itself fosters a relaxed, introspective state, not unlike the transitional phase between sleep and wakefulness, when defenses naturally tend to loosen. Sessions are typically held several times a week at consistent intervals, providing a stable and predictable therapeutic framework. This regularity cultivates a sense of psychological safety that empowers patients to delve into disturbing or shameful material. The analyst maintains a stance of neutrality and detached curiosity, refraining from offering advice, praise, or criticism. This non-directive posture serves as a blank screen, allowing patients to project their unconscious conflicts, fantasies, and relational patterns without external influence or distortion. Mastering the practice of free association requires patients to unlearn deeply ingrained habits of thought and communication. From an early age, individuals are conditioned to organize their ideas coherently and to present themselves in socially acceptable ways. Free association demands that these conventional controls be set aside, creating space for unconscious material to surface without interference. Initially, many patients find this instruction difficult. They may claim that their minds are blank, or that their thoughts are too trivial, disorganized, or embarrassing to share. Such responses often reflect resistance to the analytic process rather than a true inability to associate freely. The analyst's task is to help the patient recognize these resistances and gradually work through them, offering encouragement while reinforcing the value of continued, uncensored expression. Over time, patients typically develop an increased capacity to observe their own inner processes and articulate them more freely. This growing self-awareness and honesty form the bedrock of meaningful analytic work and are essential for the eventual resolution of unconscious conflict. Resistance is one of the most crucial phenomena observed during the process of free association. As individuals begin to draw closer to repressed thoughts and feelings, they unknowingly develop tactics to steer away from confronting troubling psychological material. This resistance may surface as a sudden mental block, complaints about the therapeutic method, or a shift toward overly analytical conversations that sidestep emotional content. Patients may also demonstrate resistance through behaviors such as arriving late, missing appointments, or experiencing physical ailments that disrupt the therapeutic process. These actions reflect an internal struggle between the desire for healing and the apprehension of facing deeply painful truths. Freud did not interpret resistance as a mere hindrance. Rather, he saw it as a revealing window into the patient's defenses and inner conflicts. Addressing resistance becomes a fundamental aspect of psychoanalytic work, as it exposes the unique strategies each person uses to shield themselves from emotional pain. By identifying and interpreting these patterns, the analyst assists the patient in recognizing their habitual defense mechanisms and understanding their roots in early experiences. Transference is another key dynamic that naturally arises during free association. As therapy progresses, patients begin to express emotions toward the analyst that are, in fact, rooted in earlier relationships, typically with significant figures from their past. The analytic setting reactivates dynamics similar to early parent-child interactions, wherein one person holds perceived authority and wisdom, while the other seeks care and understanding. These transference responses can include intense feelings of love, anger, fear, or dependency, emotions that may seem disproportionate or inappropriate to the actual therapeutic context. Yet these reactions offer profound insight into the patient's historical relationship templates and current interpersonal struggles. Rather than suppressing such feelings, the analyst encourages their full expression, guiding the patient toward an understanding of their true origins and psychological significance. The process of working through transference frequently becomes the cornerstone of psychoanalytic therapy. It offers patients a unique opportunity to relive and resolve unresolved conflicts from their developmental past. Although the intensity of transference emotions can be unsettling for both patient and analyst, these reactions provide direct access to unconscious material that would otherwise remain obscured. Successfully interpreting and processing transference fosters deeper self-awareness and helps patients develop the capacity for more balanced, mature relationships in their current lives. Interpretation, in this context, is the analyst's tool for helping the patient uncover the unconscious meaning behind their associations, behaviors, and recurring thought patterns. A skillful interpretation draws connections between present material, deeper internal conflicts, early developmental experiences, and relationship dynamics. The timing of these interpretations is critical. Delivering them too early may provoke increased resistance, while waiting too long risks losing valuable therapeutic momentum. The analyst must carefully assess when the patient is psychologically prepared to face difficult insights without becoming overly anxious or defensive. The purpose of interpretation is not simply to convey intellectual knowledge, but to foster emotional understanding that can bring about lasting psychological transformation. For interpretations to be effective, patients must not only grasp them cognitively, but also feel their truth on an emotional level. This journey often entails considerable emotional upheaval, as patients are asked to confront disowned parts of themselves that they may have avoided for years. The therapeutic relationship offers a secure and supportive environment, enabling patients to endure and engage with this challenging yet vital inner work. Free association provides a window into the workings of primary process thinking, which typically operates beneath conscious awareness. As individuals begin to loosen their grip on logical reasoning, their thoughts start to follow patterns dictated by unconscious processes rather than deliberate rational analysis. Connections between ideas emerge based on emotional resonance, symbolic likeness, or simply because they occurred close together in time, rather than through reasoned logic. Words or concepts may evoke multiple layers of meaning, bringing forth memories or associations that appear disconnected from a rational perspective. Patients often shift abruptly from one topic to another in ways that might seem erratic on the surface, but are deeply rooted in their internal emotional landscape. Recognizing these seemingly illogical thought patterns allows both therapist and patient to uncover the emotional coherence behind behaviors that may otherwise appear nonsensical or symptomatic. The ability to engage with primary process thinking while still maintaining the structure of secondary process thought reflects a kind of psychological adaptability. This flexibility supports not only creative thinking, but also the development of emotional insight. Cultivating an appreciation for both conscious and unconscious modes of thought becomes a central aim and a valuable outcome of effective psychoanalytic work. The method of free association has had a far-reaching influence on many types of psychological treatment, including those practiced outside the bounds of traditional psychoanalysis. The core idea, encouraging spontaneous, unfiltered expression to reveal unconscious material, has been adapted into numerous therapeutic frameworks. In creative therapies, for instance, tools like visual art, music, and movement are employed to enable free expression, particularly when words are insufficient or inaccessible. Group therapy often incorporates elements of free association to help participants uncover shared emotional experiences and explore relational dynamics. Even short-term or solution-focused therapies sometimes borrow from this technique to guide clients into a deeper awareness of their immediate psychological concerns. The foundational belief that healing requires access to unconscious experience continues to inform modern therapeutic practices, regardless of theoretical school. Despite its enduring value, classical free association demands rigorous training and significant time investment, making it impractical in many clinical settings. Still, a deep understanding of its principles can benefit all therapists. It emphasizes the necessity of creating a therapeutic space where individuals feel safe enough to explore their inner worlds freely, without fear of being judged or having their experiences interpreted too quickly. Part 5. The Unconscious Mind. Sigmund Freud's most groundbreaking and transformative insight was the discovery of the unconscious mind. Prior to his work, the prevailing belief among philosophers and early psychologists was that consciousness encompassed the entirety of human mental activity. Anything outside of our immediate awareness was assumed to be psychologically non-existent. Freud's clinical observations of patients with hysteria and other enigmatic disorders challenged this view. A major breakthrough occurred during his experiments with hypnosis. Under hypnosis, patients were able to recall traumatic memories that had been entirely inaccessible in their normal waking state. Even more remarkably, once these buried memories surfaced, the patients often experienced dramatic physical improvements. In some cases, individuals who had been paralyzed for years suddenly regained mobility. These outcomes revealed the existence of powerful psychological processes occurring completely beyond conscious awareness. Freud came to understand that he had uncovered a previously unknown dimension of the human psyche. He later conceptualized the mind as operating on three distinct levels, each with unique characteristics and roles. The conscious mind includes all the thoughts, emotions, sensations, and perceptions we are aware of in any given moment. When you feel the breeze on your skin or recall what you ate for breakfast, you are engaging with conscious content. Yet, Freud maintained that this conscious layer represents only a minuscule portion of the mind's total activity, less than 10% by his estimate. Just beneath it lies the preconscious mind, which stores memories and ideas not currently in our awareness but easily retrievable. For example, if someone asks you to name your first grade teacher, you may pause briefly before the name surfaces. That information resided in your preconscious until prompted. The preconscious functions like a vast internal archive, housing knowledge and learned skills accumulated over a lifetime. Abilities such as riding a bicycle or speaking your native language are primarily stored here. Although not constantly in the foreground, this information can be accessed as needed without overwhelming the conscious mind. Additionally, the preconscious contains thoughts and emotions that, with deliberate attention, can become part of our conscious experience. In contrast, the unconscious mind harbors the majority of our mental content. Freud believed this domain held repressed memories, socially unacceptable desires, primal instincts, and unresolved traumas. Unlike the preconscious, unconscious material cannot be accessed simply by trying to remember. It remains hidden due to active psychological mechanisms that keep it suppressed. The unconscious mind follows its own distinct logic, which differs sharply from rational thought. It does not adhere to linear time, logical consistency, or the principle of non-contradiction. In the unconscious, early childhood experiences coexist with recent events, and mutually conflicting desires or fears may exist side by side without issue. To illustrate the structure of the mind, Freud famously used the image of an iceberg. In this metaphor, The small visible tip above the water represents conscious awareness. Just below the surface lies the preconscious, while the vast, submerged portion symbolizes the unconscious mind. As the submerged mass determines the iceberg's movement and stability, so too does the unconscious govern much of our behavior, feelings, and inner life. We may experience anxiety with no clear cause, feel inexplicably drawn to certain individuals, or react intensely to seemingly trivial situations. Freud argued that such phenomena are best explained by the workings of the unconscious. Hidden conflicts, unresolved traumas, and repressed memories continue to shape our lives, often without our knowledge. The unconscious mind harbors a wide range of mental material that exists outside of conscious awareness. Among the most significant are repressed memories, painful or traumatic experiences that were too distressing to remain in our conscious minds. For example, a young child who witnesses a horrific accident might completely lose all conscious recollection of the event, yet the buried memory can still shape their behavior. They may develop an irrational fear of automobiles or experience anxiety in specific places without any clear explanation. Alongside repressed memories, the unconscious also stores impulses and desires deemed unacceptable by societal norms. Cultural teachings often label certain thoughts as taboo, especially those related to sexuality or aggression. To avoid the discomfort, guilt, or inner turmoil these urges might provoke, the mind pushes them out of awareness. These unwanted thoughts are not erased, but hidden deep within the unconscious, where they continue to exert influence beneath the surface. In addition to its storehouse of hidden content, the unconscious operates through what Freud termed primary process thinking. This primitive mental mode functions under the pleasure principle, an instinctual drive to immediately satisfy desires, regardless of consequences or logic. Unlike conscious thought, which relies on rational analysis, primary process thinking expresses itself through vivid images, emotional impressions, and symbolic representations. Dreams are the clearest example of this unconscious mode of thought in action. During sleep, our minds slip into this symbolic and nonlinear way of processing. Dreams often defy logic, blending events from various points in our lives and merging people or experiences into single figures. A dream character might represent multiple individuals, and memories from childhood might intertwine with recent events in ways that seem nonsensical when awake. Freud maintained that the unconscious mind is governed entirely by the pleasure principle. Its fundamental aim is to pursue gratification and avoid discomfort, without taking real-world limitations into account. If human behavior were dictated solely by these unconscious drives, we would resemble infants, insistent on immediate satisfaction without regard for rules, consequences, or social expectations. In contrast, the conscious and preconscious layers of the mind function according to the reality principle. These more developed systems weigh options, consider long-term goals, and assess what is socially acceptable or practically achievable. This ongoing battle between the instinctual urges of the unconscious and the reality-oriented judgments of the conscious mind is at the heart of much inner psychological tension. Freud believed this internal struggle is a defining aspect of human existence. He explored various ways in which the unconscious reveals itself despite its hidden nature. Among the most direct paths to unconscious material is through dreams, where the mind's usual defenses relax and repressed thoughts rise to the surface in disguised, symbolic forms. Another pathway through which the unconscious becomes visible is through what are now commonly known as Freudian slips, accidental remarks or verbal errors that seem to betray deeper thoughts. When a person unintentionally says something inappropriate or revealing, Freud argued that it was a glimpse into the unconscious, breaking through the barrier of conscious self-control. Humor, too, can be a window into hidden desires. Jokes often mask socially unacceptable ideas, allowing us to express what we cannot say openly. By cloaking forbidden thoughts in laughter, humor offers a socially permissible outlet for the unconscious. Similarly, the technique of free association, encouraging someone to speak spontaneously without filtering their thoughts, was designed to bypass the censoring function of the conscious mind, revealing deeper, often surprising, mental connections. Freud's conception of the unconscious fundamentally changed how we understand the human psyche. It challenged the notion that people are primarily rational beings who act based on deliberate conscious decisions. Instead, it suggested that much of our behavior is influenced by unseen internal forces beyond our awareness or control. The belief in a unified, self-directed individual is, according to Freud, more illusion than reality. Within each person exist multiple psychological subsystems, each with its own goals, logic, and methods of operation. While these internal forces sometimes cooperate, they frequently clash. When the tension between them becomes overwhelming and the conscious mind cannot mediate effectively, the result can be emotional or psychological disturbance. For Freud, delving into the unconscious mind was not just a theoretical exercise, it was essential for treating mental illness and guiding individuals toward deeper self-understanding. By uncovering the hidden dimensions of the psyche, people can begin to resolve internal conflicts and move toward greater self-awareness and emotional well-being. Part 6. Dreams and Their Interpretation. Sigmund Freud famously described dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, placing dream interpretation at the heart of psychoanalytic theory. He proposed that during sleep, the mind's usual psychological defenses are lowered, allowing hidden desires and internal conflicts to emerge, though often in disguised or symbolic form. This insight was born out of Freud's own deep self-examination. One pivotal moment in Freud's introspective journey was his detailed analysis of the dream known as Irma's injection. Dissecting this dream extensively, he concluded that every dream is composed of two layers: the surface story and the underlying psychological significance. Freud labeled these layers as the manifest content and the latent content. The manifest content consists of the specific details we recall upon waking, the people, settings, events, and imagery. Beneath this surface lies the latent content, which holds the dream's hidden psychological message. This is where the unconscious attempts to communicate its deeper concerns or unresolved wishes. Freud discovered consistent patterns in the way these two levels of content relate to one another, and he dedicated many years to mapping these relationships. In his view, dreams function primarily as expressions of wish fulfillment, enabling us to experience forbidden or repressed desires in a masked and non-threatening form. The mental process that reshapes latent thoughts into manifest imagery is what Freud termed dream work. He identified several core mechanisms that facilitate this transformation. One is condensation, where multiple ideas, emotions, or individuals are merged into a single element of the dream. For example, a dream character might simultaneously embody traits of your father, a supervisor, and an old teacher, compressing several relationships into one symbolic figure. This technique allows the unconscious mind to convey complex emotions and inner conflicts with surprising efficiency. Another mechanism, displacement, redirects emotional energy from a significant concern to a seemingly minor aspect of the dream. For instance, dreaming about misplacing your keys may actually reflect deep-seated anxieties about job insecurity. The troubling emotion is shifted onto a less threatening symbol. Symbolization is another vital component of dream work. Through this process, abstract feelings and socially unacceptable desires are converted into tangible visual symbols. Freud compiled an extensive list of frequently occurring dream symbols and their typical interpretations. Long, slender objects such as canes, poles, or pens, for example, often symbolize the male genitalia. Conversely, enclosed shapes like boxes, rooms, or vehicles are typically seen as representations of the female sexual organ. Dreams of flying may express a yearning for sexual release or a desire to escape societal constraints. Water in dreams frequently suggests birth, emotional purification, or a return to the womb. Being pursued in a dream often signals an effort to avoid confronting a painful truth or internal conflict. Dreams about losing teeth can suggest themes of castration anxiety, vulnerability, or fears related to aging and mortality. Despite identifying recurring symbols, Freud cautioned strongly against relying solely on fixed symbolic meanings. He emphasized that individual associations often carry more weight than general interpretations. Another process Freud identified is secondary revision, which occurs when we recall and recount our dreams. As we attempt to make sense of fragmented images, the conscious mind imposes structure and logic, weaving the raw dream material into a seemingly coherent narrative. As a result, we might recall the dream as having a clear plot or resolution, even if the original experience was chaotic or nonsensical. This editing process can obscure the dream's true meaning. For this reason, Freud advised patients to record their dreams as soon as they woke up, when the dream material was still fresh and less likely to have been reshaped by conscious interference. Immediate recollection preserves more of the original symbolic detail. Freud also identified distinct categories of dreams. One is the wish fulfillment dream, in which unconscious desires are gratified symbolically. For instance, a person who is hungry might dream of enjoying a lavish meal, while someone feeling powerless might dream of becoming a powerful figure. Then there are anxiety dreams, which appear to challenge the wish fulfillment theory because they provoke distress instead of pleasure. Freud contended, however, that these dreams still reflect unconscious wishes, specifically, the wish to be punished. In such cases, the superego enforces moral judgment through the dream, creating anxiety as a form of internal retribution for unacceptable thoughts or urges. A third type is the traumatic dream, in which painful events are relived again and again. Initially, these dreams perplexed Freud because they seemed to defy the pleasure principle. Eventually, he explained them through his concepts of the death drive and repetition compulsion, suggesting that the mind compulsively replays overwhelming experiences as a way of attempting to gain mastery over them. Children's dreams offered critical support for Freud's theory of wish fulfillment. Youngsters often dream in a straightforward and literal way, with their unconscious desires on full display. For instance, a child refused candy during the day might dream that night of indulging endlessly in sweets. As individuals grow older, their dreams become increasingly layered and symbolic, a change driven by social influences that enforce stricter suppression of unacceptable wishes. As adults, dream interpretation becomes more complex and requires careful psychological analysis to uncover hidden meanings. The same inner mechanisms responsible for neurotic behavior also shape the content of dreams. Both neurotic symptoms and dreams serve as compromises between suppressed urges and internalized moral constraints. This parallel made dream interpretation a vital method for exploring the roots of psychological disturbances. To analyze dreams in therapy, Freud introduced specific interpretive techniques. Chief among them was free association, a process where the patient focused on individual dream components and verbalized every thought that came to mind, without filtering or judgment. These spontaneous connections often uncovered personal meanings far more revealing than generalized symbolic interpretations. The emotional intensity of a patient's associations provided key insights into the dream's deeper significance. A strong emotional response to what seemed like an insignificant detail often signaled an underlying psychological conflict. Moments of resistance during analysis, such as avoidance, silence, or discomfort, highlighted areas guarded by especially strong defense mechanisms. When a patient was unable or unwilling to make associations with a particular dream element or expressed unease when discussing it, this often indicated that the content was closely linked to repressed memories or unresolved emotional material. Interpreting dreams also shed light on a person's psychological history and current inner struggles. Recurring dreams frequently pointed to lingering childhood issues that continued to shape adult behavior. The individuals who appeared in dreams usually symbolized important figures from the dreamer's past or present life. The interactions between these dream figures revealed patterns of internal psychological relationships. The dream's locations often represented different facets of the dreamer's personality or significant real-life circumstances. Emotions experienced during dreams gave direct access to feelings that might otherwise be denied or hidden during waking consciousness. Freud's theories about dreams had a transformative impact on our understanding of the human psyche. They illustrated that mental processes do not cease during sleep, but instead operate under a unique set of rules distinct from rational, waking thought. Dreams demonstrated that the unconscious mind remains active, continuously processing emotional experiences beneath the surface of awareness. The symbolic structure of dreams revealed the mind's preference for metaphor and indirect expression over linear, logical reasoning. Dream interpretation emerged as a powerful gateway into unconscious material, unearthing buried memories, inner conflicts, and suppressed desires. By exploring their dream content, individuals could develop profound insight into their most deeply rooted fears and motivations. This self-awareness laid the groundwork for both emotional healing and personal transformation. Dreams allowed people to uncover hidden links between their thoughts, experiences, and emotions, connections that often remained invisible through conscious introspection alone. Part 7. Freud's Structural Model of the Mind. Freud proposed a tripartite model of the psyche, comprising three interrelated components: the id, ego, and superego. This conceptual framework, introduced later in his work, reflected his evolving insights into the nature of psychological conflict. According to Freud, these three elements are in constant tension, each vying to influence our thoughts, emotions, and actions. Understanding the interplay among these inner forces sheds light on why individuals often feel internally divided and why psychological disturbances can emerge. Mental well-being, Freud argued, depends on maintaining a dynamic equilibrium among these components, rather than allowing one to overpower the others. Each part functions by its own set of principles and fulfills a unique role in the psyche. The ID represents the most primal part of the personality. It is the source of our instinctual drives, including hunger, thirst, sexual desire, and aggression. Operating entirely under the pleasure principle, the id seeks immediate satisfaction of its urges without regard for consequences or the demands of reality. Existing entirely within the unconscious, the id has no direct interaction with the external world. It disregards logic, contradicts itself freely, and remains completely uninfluenced by moral considerations. When you experience sudden cravings, sexual urges, or flashes of anger, these are manifestations of the id pushing into awareness. The ID functions through what Freud called primary process thinking, a non-logical, fantasy-driven mode of thought that relies on imagery and wish fulfillment rather than reason. It demands instant gratification, irrespective of context or appropriateness. Contained within the ID is the libido, the core life force that energizes all psychological activity. While Freud initially viewed libido as solely sexual in nature, he later broadened the concept to include all impulses aimed at pleasure and self-preservation. Alongside the life-affirming libido, the id also houses destructive drives, aggressive impulses that seek to dominate, harm, or dismantle. These forces exist in a complex relationship, balancing creation and destruction. Without the ID, there would be no drive to seek nourishment, reproduce, defend oneself, or pursue enjoyment. However, if the ED acted without any checks or limitations, people would behave like infants, demanding immediate satisfaction of every desire. Social life would be impossible if everyone followed only the dictates of the ID, ignoring the needs and boundaries of others. Although it supplies the essential energy for motivation, the ED requires guidance from other psychological systems to function adaptively. The ego emerges to perform this regulatory role, acting as the rational mediator between the ID's demands and the constraints of the real world. It operates according to the reality principle, weighing practical outcomes and environmental limitations before making decisions. The ego begins to develop in early childhood as the individual learns to postpone gratification and respond to social norms. Unlike the ID, which is fully unconscious, the ego spans all levels of consciousness: unconscious, preconscious, and conscious. It employs reason, memory, perception, and problem-solving to handle everyday challenges. The ego's goal is to find realistic, socially acceptable ways to satisfy the ID's desires while minimizing negative repercussions. For instance, when you feel hungry, your ego helps you identify where and when it's appropriate to eat, factoring in time, setting, and social context. The ego relies on secondary process thinking, a rational, ordered form of thought that recognizes cause and effect relationships and considers future consequences. It can delay gratification when acting impulsively would lead to problems. By staying connected to the external world through sensory input, the ego adjusts behavior based on experience and feedback. Over time, it develops more refined strategies for fulfilling internal needs within acceptable limits. A well-functioning ego is capable of managing frustration, balancing internal and external demands, and maintaining psychological stability even under pressure. However, when the ego is overwhelmed by the ID's urges, the superego's strict demands, or external stressors, mental symptoms can arise. Feelings of anxiety often indicate that the ego is struggling to manage these conflicting pressures. Similarly, depression may occur when the ego perceives itself as powerless to achieve significant goals or satisfy essential needs. The superego serves as our internal moral compass, embodying the ethical principles, societal expectations, and ideals that we acquire from our parents and cultural environment. It begins to form during the phallic phase of psychosexual development, a stage when children resolve their Oedipal dilemmas by aligning themselves with the parent of the same gender. Within the superego, two distinct elements function to guide our moral behavior in different ways. The conscience is the part that triggers guilt or anxiety when we transgress moral boundaries or even contemplate unacceptable behaviors. It acts as an internal enforcer, issuing psychological consequences for both actual misdeeds and imagined violations. In contrast, the ego ideal inspires feelings of pride and fulfillment when we act in accordance with our highest ethical standards or accomplish goals that align with our moral ideals. It serves as an internal source of validation for virtuous actions and honorable intentions. Together, the conscience and ego ideal form a sophisticated internal ethical framework that governs behavior, even in the absence of external oversight or authority figures. However, the influence of the superego can vary greatly, and its extremes can give rise to psychological issues. When the superego is excessively rigid or unforgiving, it may lead to intense guilt, chronic perfectionism, and harsh self-criticism that disrupt a person's ability to function normally. Individuals with an overactive superego might condemn themselves for natural urges or hold themselves to unrealistically high standards. Such individuals can become immobilized by moral distress, unable to embrace healthy pleasures or feel at ease. On the other hand, an underdeveloped or weak superego may result in moral indifference and antisocial tendencies. People lacking a well-formed superego might engage in dishonest, harmful, or reckless behaviors without experiencing guilt. Their moral behavior becomes entirely dependent on external consequences, as they lack an internal sense of right and wrong. For psychological health and maturity, it is essential to develop a superego that offers ethical direction without becoming oppressively punitive. The intricate relationship among the id, ego, and superego is what gives rise to the complexity of human personality. These systems are often at odds with one another in moments of decision. The id may demand instant gratification of desires, especially sexual or aggressive impulses, while the superego strongly condemns those same urges as immoral. In such situations, the ego must negotiate a compromise that respects the demands of both, while also acknowledging the constraints of reality. These internal deliberations typically occur outside of conscious awareness, yet they profoundly shape our thoughts, emotions, and actions. When internal tensions become overwhelming, the ego activates defense mechanisms to reduce psychological stress and preserve inner balance. Although these defenses help maintain stability, they can sometimes produce confusing symptoms or problematic behaviors. Such patterns can only be understood by recognizing the hidden structural conflicts among the psyche's components. The aim of effective psychoanalytic therapy is to fortify the ego so that it can better mediate these internal tensions. Personality styles differ based on which psychic structure exerts the most influence. Individuals driven primarily by the ID often act on impulse, pursue pleasure without restraint, and display intense emotional expression. They may find it hard to delay gratification or evaluate the long-term effects of their actions. In contrast, those whose lives are ruled by the superego tend to be excessively self-restrained, morally rigid, and self-judging. They frequently struggle with excessive guilt, perfectionistic tendencies, and an inability to derive enjoyment from life. Those with a well-developed ego, however, manage to strike a healthy balance between impulse and discipline. They can fulfill their needs while still respecting ethical values and practical limitations. The objective of psychological growth is not to eliminate any one part of the psyche, but rather to foster a harmonious integration of all three elements, ID, ego, and superego, working together in balanced cooperation. Freud's structural theory offered a foundational lens through which psychological conflict and mental disorders could be understood. Neurotic symptoms are frequently seen as the result of failed attempts to mediate tensions among the mind's internal systems. Disorders rooted in anxiety may arise when the ego struggles to contain impulses from the ID or to satisfy the rigid demands of the superego. Depressive states can develop when the superego harshly criticizes or punishes the ego, often in response to perceived moral failings or inadequacies. Gaining insight into these internal structural dynamics became a cornerstone of effective psychoanalytic therapy. Through this framework, clinicians were better equipped to help individuals identify their unconscious conflicts and adopt more adaptive strategies for handling the pressures exerted by different parts of the psyche. This structural perspective profoundly reshaped the way human motivation and psychological growth are conceptualized. It demonstrated that personality is not a product of a singular, rational self, but rather the outcome of continuous internal negotiation among distinct components of the mind. Part 8. Stages of Psychosexual Development. Freud theorized that personality evolves through 5 key psychosexual stages throughout early life, from infancy into adolescence. Each stage centers around a specific erogenous zone where both physical pleasure and internal psychological conflicts arise. The way a child progresses through these stages plays a vital role in shaping their future personality traits, relational dynamics, and potential mental health issues. Freud's ideas were highly controversial, especially in the conservative climate of Victorian society, as he proposed that even infants possess sexual drives from birth. However, Freud defined sexuality more broadly than adult genital expression. It encompassed all forms of bodily pleasure and desire. These stages represent universal human experiences, although each individual's progression can vary depending on parenting methods and environmental conditions. When difficulties arise in navigating a particular stage, the resulting unresolved conflicts can cause psychological fixations that affect a person's behavior well into adulthood. The oral stage. This first stage spans from birth to roughly 18 months of age. At this time, an infant's mouth is the central source of sensory pleasure and the primary means of exploring the world. Activities such as sucking, biting, and chewing are not only gratifying but also help the infant engage with their surroundings. Feeding experiences, especially nursing, form the basis of the child's earliest emotional bonds with caregivers. Parental responses to the infant's oral needs are critically important for healthy personality development. When feeding is consistent, warm, and responsive, the infant develops a sense of trust and emotional security. On the other hand, if feeding is erratic, neglectful, or overly harsh, it can instill feelings of anxiety and dependence that carry into adult relationships. Through these early interactions, the infant forms their initial impressions of the world, whether it's a nurturing environment or one of frustration and scarcity. Oral fixations may develop later in life based on the nature of the infant's feeding experiences. If the child receives excessive oral gratification or their needs are too easily met, they may grow into what Freud termed an oral receptive personality. Such individuals tend to be overly reliant on others for comfort and approval. They might come across as naive, submissive, or constantly in need of reassurance and care. In contrast, oral aggressive personalities form when the child experiences unmet oral needs, perhaps due to early or forceful weaning. These individuals often adopt a combative or dominating attitude in their attempts to fulfill emotional needs. They might be argumentative, cynical, or exhibit hostility in the way they communicate. In both cases, unresolved oral fixations can manifest in adulthood through behaviors such as excessive eating, drinking, smoking, or compulsive oral habits like nail biting, gum chewing, or incessant talking. Such individuals may also struggle with emotional dependency and have difficulty being alone or self-sufficient. The anal stage. The second stage of development takes place between approximately 18 months and 3 years of age. During this phase, the focus of pleasure shifts to the anus as children begin to experience control and satisfaction through bowel movements. Toilet training becomes a central developmental task and marks the child's first significant clash between internal impulses and external social expectations. This stage introduces the child to the idea that natural bodily urges must be managed according to rules imposed by others, typically their parents. The way toilet training is handled can deeply influence the child's future relationship with authority, self-discipline, and independence. Learning to regulate bodily functions teaches the child to balance their personal desires with the demands of the outside world, laying the groundwork for future interactions involving structure, responsibility, and control. How this stage is navigated can shape the child's lifelong approach to organization, autonomy, and compliance with societal norms. If toilet training is excessively strict, punitive, or demanding, the child may develop what Freud identified as an anal retentive personality. As adults, these individuals often become obsessively tidy, rigid, and controlling. They might display extreme attention to punctuality, cleanliness, and order, sometimes to the point of perfectionism. Such individuals can feel intense discomfort when their environment becomes chaotic or unpredictable, and they often struggle to be spontaneous or adapt to change. Conversely, if parents are overly relaxed or permissive during toilet training, the child may form an anal expulsive personality. Adults with this pattern tend to be disorganized, careless, and undisciplined. They may resist rules or structure and show a disregard for neatness or order in their personal and professional lives. Some individuals may exhibit a tendency to be habitually late, careless in their appearance, and inconsistent or irresponsible when it comes to financial matters or personal obligations. Though both types of anal personality deal with control-related challenges, they express these struggles in distinctly opposite ways. The phallic stage emerges between the ages of roughly 3 and 6. During this developmental phase, children begin to recognize anatomical differences between the sexes and start to explore their sense of sexual identity. They discover that stimulating their genital area can evoke pleasurable feelings, making it the primary erogenous zone during this period. More importantly, children begin to form emotional and romantic attachments to their opposite-sex parent while experiencing rivalry and competitiveness toward their same-sex parent. This dynamic is famously known as the Oedipus complex in boys and the Electra complex in girls, and it represents one of the most pivotal psychological challenges in early development. How these internal conflicts are addressed significantly shapes the child's emerging sense of gender identity. The outcomes of this stage also play a critical role in the development of a moral conscience and influence future relationship patterns. It is during the phallic stage that the superego, the internalized set of moral standards, starts to take shape, largely through the child's identification with the same-sex parent. By resolving feelings of competition, children adopt the ethical values and expectations modeled by their parents. When this stage is navigated successfully, it typically results in a stable gender identity and the development of appropriate moral understanding. Boys begin to relate closely with their fathers and cultivate traditionally masculine traits, while girls identify with their mothers and embrace traditionally feminine roles. Additionally, children absorb moral teachings and begin to experience guilt and develop the ability for ethical reasoning. However, failure to resolve the psychological struggles of the phallic stage may lead to a variety of emotional and behavioral issues. These can include confusion about one's gender role, resistance to authority, or challenges in forming close romantic relationships. In some cases, individuals may remain psychologically fixated on their opposite-sex parent, hindering their ability to engage in mature partnerships. Others might experience persistent guilt or unease about sexual desires and impulses. This stage also introduces core emotional experiences such as rivalry, envy, and competition, which can shape interpersonal dynamics for years to come. Learning to channel and manage these strong feelings in a healthy manner becomes essential for emotional and psychological stability. Following the phallic stage is the latency period, which spans from around 6 years old until the onset of puberty. During this time, sexual urges are largely suppressed, allowing children to concentrate on intellectual growth and social development. It is considered a quieter phase in terms of emotional conflict, enabling children to invest in academics, peer relationships, and skill building. The repression of sexual instincts during this period facilitates the development of same-sex friendships and encourages engagement in activities such as sports, hobbies, and academic pursuits. Freud believed that although sexual drives are subdued, they do not disappear entirely. Instead, they are transformed into socially constructive activities through the mechanism of sublimation. Children might display intense enthusiasm for collecting items, mastering new games, or excelling in schoolwork. This latency phase provides a vital opportunity for the ego to strengthen and for previous psychosexual gains to be solidified. Without the burden of the earlier internal conflicts, children are free to build confidence and refine their social abilities. The genital stage begins with puberty and lasts into adulthood. At this point, sexual drives resurface with renewed energy, and the genitals again become the central focus of pleasure. However, unlike the earlier self-oriented expressions of sexuality, this stage marks a shift toward mutual satisfaction and emotional connection with others. As adolescents mature, they begin to form deep, meaningful relationships that integrate physical attraction with emotional intimacy and genuine care. This stage represents the culmination of psychosexual development in which individuals are capable of sustaining fulfilling, long-term romantic relationships. A well-developed capacity for love and intimacy reflects the successful integration of lessons and resolutions from earlier stages. Conversely, individuals who have unresolved conflicts from previous developmental phases may find it difficult to manage the demands of adult relationships or sexual expression. The genital stage symbolizes the ultimate objective of Freud's psychosexual model, where emotional maturity, healthy sexual identity, and social functionality are fully realized through the harmonious integration of earlier developmental experiences. Freud's model of psychosexual development brought significant insight into how personality is shaped and how psychological issues originate. It emphasized that experiences during early childhood leave a lasting imprint on adult behavior and personality traits. The way in which parents respond to fundamental tasks, such as feeding, toilet training, and the child's emerging sexual awareness, can set enduring behavioral patterns. This developmental approach offered a compelling explanation for the sudden appearance of psychological symptoms in adulthood. These issues often stem from unresolved inner conflicts rooted in much earlier stages of development. Gaining a deep understanding of psychosexual development became a crucial aspect of psychoanalytic therapy, as it served as a guide for uncovering and interpreting early formative experiences. Armed with this framework, therapists could assist individuals in identifying psychological fixations and addressing conflicts that had not been resolved during earlier stages of growth. Moreover, this theory highlighted the critical role of early parenting and its lasting impact on a child's emotional and psychological well-being. Part 9. Narcissism, Anxiety, and Neurosis. Freud's perspective on narcissism developed considerably over the course of his work, as he came to see it as a central element not only in pathological states but also in normal psychological growth. Initially, he considered narcissism to be a distorted form of sexuality, where individuals direct their libidinal energy inward, focusing on themselves instead of forming attachments to others. Over time, however, his clinical experience led him to a broader understanding. Narcissistic mechanisms are crucial for healthy psychological development, and disturbances in these processes often underlie various mental health conditions. Freud introduced the concept of primary narcissism to describe the innate self-focus present in infancy, a stage when the ego has not yet distinguished itself from the external environment. In contrast, secondary narcissism occurs when emotional energy, originally directed toward others, is retracted and reinvested in the self, typically as a defense against relational disappointment or emotional trauma. Grasping the complexities of narcissism became essential to Freud's broader theory of how individuals develop a sense of self-worth, preserve their psychological integrity under pressure, and sustain emotionally meaningful relationships throughout life. Primary narcissism defines the infant's early experience, a phase in which the child perceives themselves as the focal point of all existence. At this stage, there is little to no distinction between the child's internal desires and the external sources that fulfill or frustrate those needs. Caregivers are not yet seen as separate individuals, but rather as extensions of the infant's own being. This early narcissistic phase plays a vital developmental role by laying the groundwork for both self-confidence and personal agency. For a child to later accept the inevitable frustrations and limits of reality, they must first experience themselves as powerful and valued. Healthy narcissistic development depends largely on the responsiveness of caregivers. When parents are able to reflect back the child's sense of uniqueness, while also setting appropriate limits, they foster a robust and resilient self-esteem. Consistent admiration and validation from caregivers enable children to develop a stable sense of self that can weather future challenges. In contrast, children who are met with neglect, excessive criticism, or inconsistent emotional responses during this stage often grow up with persistent self-esteem difficulties. One of the most significant milestones in early development is the shift from primary narcissism to object love, that is, the ability to relate to others as independent beings. As children begin to understand that their parents have their own emotions, needs, and limitations, they are confronted with the unsettling truth that perfect, unconditional gratification is unattainable. This realization introduces feelings of anxiety and disappointment as the child begins to grasp that love must be earned rather than simply assumed. Successfully navigating this transition enables the formation of mature, reciprocal relationships, ones grounded in mutual recognition and empathy, rather than in narcissistic control or idealization. A healthy balance between self-love and concern for others emerges only when both narcissistic and object-related desires are integrated. To maintain psychological stability, individuals must possess enough self-regard to uphold their identity, while also being emotionally invested in the well-being of others. When this integration fails, it can manifest in one of two extremes: excessive narcissism, which impairs intimacy and empathy, or a severe lack of narcissism, which may result in chronic self-sacrifice and emotional depletion. Freud saw understanding these developmental dynamics as key to helping individuals build more stable self-worth and form healthier relational patterns. Pathological narcissism arises when these early developmental processes are disrupted, whether by emotional trauma, deficient caregiving, or innate vulnerabilities that hinder the formation of a stable ego. People suffering from this condition often display a puzzling mixture of inflated self-importance and deep-seated feelings of worthlessness and shame. They often seek constant validation and expect to be treated as inherently superior, yet they are highly reactive to any form of criticism or perceived disrespect. In relationships, they tend to manipulate or use others, viewing people not as autonomous beings deserving of genuine connection, but rather as tools for affirming their inflated self-image. When their perceived uniqueness is challenged, they may react with intense narcissistic rage. Such outbursts can also occur when they encounter boundaries or limitations that contradict their inflated sense of entitlement. A core difficulty for them lies in their limited capacity for empathy, as recognizing the independent feelings and needs of others would threaten their internal narrative of being the central figure in every situation. Despite their outward arrogance, this grandiosity often conceals profound feelings of emptiness, inadequacy, and a deep fear of being unremarkable or insignificant. Understanding that narcissistic behaviors often serve as defenses against these inner vulnerabilities has allowed therapists to adopt more compassionate and effective treatment strategies. These approaches aim to address the underlying emotional wounds rather than merely confronting the exaggerated self-image. In Freudian theory, anxiety plays a foundational role, functioning as an alarm system that alerts the ego to impending psychological danger and activates defensive mechanisms. Freud differentiated between two types of anxiety: realistic anxiety, which arises in response to actual threats from the external world, and neurotic anxiety, which stems from unresolved internal conflicts. Realistic anxiety is adaptive, prompting protective action in the face of genuine risks to physical or emotional safety. In contrast, neurotic anxiety occurs when repressed internal impulses threaten to surface into consciousness. The ego interprets these impulses as dangerous because acting on them would provoke internal conflict or clash with societal norms and superego expectations. For instance, someone may feel anxious in social settings due to unconscious hostile urges that, if expressed, could jeopardize significant relationships. Differentiating between the sources of anxiety has proven essential in developing therapeutic interventions that go beyond symptom management and target the root psychological conflicts. Anxiety disorders frequently reflect the ego's unsuccessful efforts to cope with overwhelming internal tensions through various defense mechanisms. Signal anxiety is a specific form of this phenomenon, acting as an early warning system that alerts the ego to potential psychological threats before they become overwhelming. This mechanism enables the ego to activate defenses that maintain psychological equilibrium and prevent internal conflict from disrupting conscious life. When signal anxiety functions properly, individuals can face psychological stress without developing debilitating symptoms. However, when the ego is inundated by competing pressures from the ID, superego, and external reality, signal anxiety may escalate into panic attacks or persistent anxiety disorders. A notable example is castration anxiety, a form of signal anxiety that appears during the phallic stage of development where a child fears punishment for Oedipal wishes. This fear often leads to identification with the same-sex parent, a process crucial to the formation of the superego. Separation anxiety, on the other hand, reflects the fear of losing vital emotional bonds and may emerge during different developmental periods, especially in the context of real or imagined loss. Gaining insight into these various forms of anxiety has enabled psychoanalysts to trace adult anxiety disorders back to their developmental roots and tailor treatments to address their deeper psychological functions. Neurosis, in psychoanalytic terms, represents a psychological compromise in which the ego negotiates conflicting demands from the ED, superego, and external reality by producing symptoms. Unlike psychosis, where the individual loses touch with reality, neurotic individuals retain a basic grasp on the external world even as they develop symptoms that symbolically express unresolved inner conflict. Conversion hysteria arises when internal psychological conflicts are transformed into physical symptoms, allowing repressed urges to be indirectly expressed while keeping them unconscious. For example, a woman unable to confront her husband with anger may develop arm paralysis, which symbolically represents her hostile feelings while also preventing her from acting on them physically. Obsessive-compulsive neurosis is marked by recurring thoughts and ritualized behaviors that act as defenses against anxiety, keeping forbidden desires at bay. A person overwhelmed by fears of contamination might engage in compulsive hand-washing as a symbolic act to purify themselves of guilt-laden sexual or aggressive impulses. In phobic neurosis, emotional conflict is displaced onto specific external objects or situations, allowing the person to avoid those triggers rather than confronting the deeper internal distress they signify. While these neurotic defenses can offer short-term relief from psychological turmoil, they frequently give rise to additional difficulties that disrupt everyday functioning and strain interpersonal relationships. Beyond isolated symptoms, neurotic character structures reflect more ingrained personality patterns that serve defensive purposes. In obsessive-compulsive personality, an overemphasis on order, precision, and control conceals deeper fears of chaos or aggression. Hysterical personalities often display exaggerated emotions and crave attention as a way of warding off inner feelings of emptiness or unworthiness. Masochistic personalities tend to adopt roles of self-denial and victimhood, driven by unconscious guilt and a need for punishment. Because these personality styles feel consistent with the individual's sense of self, they are often difficult for the person to recognize and even harder to change than more acute symptoms of neurosis. Despite this, such enduring character traits can severely hinder intimacy and limit the individual's capacity for genuine emotional spontaneity. In psychoanalysis, addressing character neurosis became essential, as these patterns often need to be explored and resolved before deeper psychological conflicts can be effectively worked through. The therapeutic aim is not to eradicate these defensive personality traits altogether, but to loosen their rigidity and allow the person greater emotional flexibility and adaptability. Psychosis, by contrast, represents a far more severe disruption in mental functioning, characterized by a breakdown in the ego's ability to distinguish between internal experience and external reality. Unlike neurotic individuals, who usually recognize their symptoms as problematic, psychotic patients often believe their hallucinations or delusions are real. Freud theorized that psychosis stems from an intense withdrawal of libidinal energy away from the external world and back into the self, resulting in extreme narcissism. This internal retreat isolates the individual from meaningful interpersonal connections and immerses them in a private realm of fantasy and delusion. However, Freud also acknowledged that psychotic symptoms might serve as attempts at psychological repair. Delusions can offer structured explanations for overwhelming experiences, while hallucinations may substitute for human connection when real relationships feel too threatening or disappointing. Recognizing that psychotic symptoms can serve defensive and reparative purposes led to more compassionate and effective therapeutic interventions. Rather than trying to suppress the symptoms outright, therapists began to understand their symbolic value and work to help patients develop healthier strategies to meet their psychological needs. The interplay between narcissism, anxiety, and neurosis reveals the intricate dynamics of emotional life. Narcissistic wounds often trigger intense anxiety, which in turn fuels neurotic defenses aimed at preserving a fragile sense of self-worth. For instance, someone who perceives criticism as a profound threat to their identity may develop obsessive behaviors in an effort to avoid future disapproval. At the same time, neurotic symptoms can serve narcissistic functions by providing a sense of uniqueness or by attracting attention that compensates for deeper feelings of inferiority. A person suffering from conversion symptoms, for example, might receive sympathy and care that were lacking during periods of health, gains which inadvertently reinforce and sustain the neurotic condition. The fear of losing narcissistic sources of affirmation often drives a range of neurotic behaviors aimed at preserving admiration and preferential treatment. Recognizing the interplay between these dynamics is crucial for effective psychoanalytic intervention, as treating symptoms in isolation rarely addresses the deeper psychological tensions at play. Achieving meaningful therapeutic outcomes generally involves confronting narcissistic sensitivities, enhancing the patient's ability to regulate anxiety, and addressing entrenched neurotic personality structures. A comprehensive approach that acknowledges how these elements interact is essential to fostering psychological growth, emotional maturity, and healthier interpersonal relationships. Part 10. Parapraxis, Sublimation, and Civilization. Freud's exploration of parapraxis, commonly referred to as Freudian slips, revealed that unconscious mental activity exerts a constant, often unnoticed influence on our everyday behaviors. These so-called errors in speech, memory, and action are not random accidents, but rather meaningful manifestations of repressed thoughts and internal conflicts that evade conscious control. In the psychopathology of everyday life, Freud demonstrated that unconscious forces do not operate solely in dreams or neurotic symptoms. They are also present in the mundane, routine actions of daily life. Seemingly trivial lapses, like saying the wrong word, forgetting someone's name, misplacing an object, or experiencing a minor injury, can serve hidden psychological purposes. If acknowledged directly, these underlying motives would often be unacceptable or distressing. Parapraxis became a crucial concept in psychoanalysis because they provided compelling evidence that unconscious processes are at work throughout normal, conscious life, not just in exceptional states such as dreaming or mental illness. These everyday occurrences offered tangible examples of how the unconscious mind functions, helping individuals begin to identify the unseen forces shaping their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Among the various forms of parapraxis, slips of the tongue are perhaps the most widely recognized. In such moments, a person unintentionally says something different from what they meant, often revealing hidden feelings or unresolved issues. For example, someone might mistakenly call their current partner by an ex-partner's name, exposing lingering emotional ties to the past. Similarly, a person harboring resentment toward their employer might blurt out an insult under the guise of a compliment. Even political leaders occasionally make verbal blunders that betray their private beliefs, despite their public personas. These slips occur because repressed thoughts and feelings carry psychological energy that constantly presses for expression. When the mind's internal censorship momentarily weakens, this unconscious material breaks through in speech. The content of such slips can provide rich insights into the speaker's inner emotional conflicts and repressed desires. Still, it's important to note that not all mistakes carry psychological meaning. Differentiating between random errors and genuinely revealing parapraxis requires careful consideration of context, frequency, and emotional significance. Forgetting constitutes another major category of parapraxis. In many cases, memory lapses are not simply accidents or signs of cognitive decline. Rather, they serve a defensive psychological function. People often forget names, appointments, or pieces of information that provoke anxiety, guilt, or inner conflict. For instance, someone might regularly forget their dentist appointments due to unconscious fears related to the procedures. Another individual might repeatedly fail to return calls to someone they secretly dislike or wish to avoid. Students may forget to study for particular exams when the subject matter stirs up feelings of inferiority, self-doubt, or competitiveness. The selective nature of such forgetfulness suggests that psychological motives, not random brain glitches, determine what is remembered and what is not. In more extreme cases, motivated forgetting can lead to repressed memories, where traumatic events become entirely inaccessible to conscious thought. However, even smaller, everyday instances of forgetting can offer clues about deeper emotional struggles and unconscious conflicts that shape one's behavior. Misplacing or losing objects is another common example of parapraxis with symbolic significance. These actions often reflect inner ambivalence toward the item or what it represents. For example, someone who frequently loses a piece of jewelry given by a partner may have unresolved feelings about the relationship. A student who keeps misplacing their textbooks might harbor unconscious resentment toward their academic obligations. Losing important papers or documents can coincide with emotional resistance to the commitments or responsibilities those items signify. Often, the timing of these losses aligns with moments of stress or impending decisions, suggesting that the unconscious mind plays an active role in avoiding confrontation with uncomfortable realities. People often rediscover lost items once the psychological conditions that led to their disappearance have shifted. Exploring the unconscious motivations behind losing objects can offer insight into inner conflicts and reveal ambivalent emotions that may have previously gone unrecognized. Unintentional injuries and seemingly chance accidents frequently carry unconscious meaning, often acting as a form of self-punishment or as a disguised expression of suppressed aggression. For instance, someone burdened by guilt over personal achievements might accidentally harm themselves in a way that disrupts career progress or life milestones. Similarly, individuals with unresolved resentment toward family members might experience mishaps that necessitate care, subtly compelling others to attend to them. In the realm of sports, athletes occasionally develop puzzling injuries just before major events. These incidents can reflect internal struggles where unconscious fears of either failure or success manifest physically. Although these episodes appear entirely spontaneous to those experiencing them, they often have deeper psychological roots that go unnoticed. Recurring patterns of accidents tend to coincide with specific emotional states or life situations, implying that they may not be entirely coincidental. Recognizing the psychological role that such incidents can play allows individuals to better understand self-sabotaging behaviors and to confront emotional issues in healthier ways. Still, it's essential to approach these interpretations with caution and not attribute deep meaning to every unfortunate event, especially when more straightforward explanations are available. Freud considered sublimation one of the most hopeful aspects of psychoanalysis, as it illustrates how primal human drives can be redirected into socially productive activities. Through sublimation, instinctual sexual or aggressive urges are transformed into pursuits that are both personally fulfilling and culturally enriching. Unlike other defense mechanisms that merely deflect or distort inner conflict, sublimation enables people to express their drives through positive and meaningful outlets. Creative endeavors, for example, often channel raw libidinal or hostile energy into artistic works that enrich culture and reflect personal authenticity. Scientific inquiry is another powerful form of sublimation, where the desire to explore and understand the world is converted into discoveries that elevate human progress. Likewise, athletic competition provides a structured space for aggressive impulses to be acted out constructively, promoting discipline and entertainment without actual harm. Successful sublimation demands psychological resilience, the ability to redirect potent emotional energy while maintaining a conscious connection to its source. When effective, sublimation creates mutually beneficial outcomes, offering personal gratification while simultaneously serving communal or cultural advancement. However, individuals vary widely in their ability to sublimate, depending on their emotional maturity, inherent talents, and access to supportive environments. Some people naturally excel at converting internal drives into artistic, intellectual, or physical accomplishments. Others find it more challenging to discover acceptable pathways for their instincts and may instead rely on less constructive defenses. Cultural context plays a critical role in shaping opportunities for sublimation by defining which pursuits are encouraged and respected. Societies that invest in avenues for artistic expression, academic exploration, and athletic excellence tend to foster more successful sublimation than those with restrictive norms or limited resources. Nevertheless, sublimation can become problematic if it leads to emotional detachment. People who excessively intellectualize their instincts may become disconnected from their deeper emotional lives, resulting in rigidity or a sense of emotional dullness. The objective isn't to suppress primitive urges entirely, but rather to integrate them into one's life in ways that honor both personal needs and collective well-being. Freud's exploration of civilization revealed a profound psychological paradox. The very mechanisms that allow societies to function also generate inevitable inner conflict. At the heart of this is sublimation, the process by which individuals redirect instinctual drives, particularly sexual and aggressive impulses, into socially acceptable outlets. While this transformation enables cooperation and cultural development, it also creates what Freud described as the discontents of civilization. The psychological tension arises from the ongoing repression of basic human instincts. The desire for immediate gratification must be sacrificed in favor of social harmony and delayed rewards. Yet the same energy that is diverted from primal urges becomes the fuel for creativity, intellectual pursuits, and moral systems. This redirected drive lies at the foundation of humanity's greatest cultural achievements. Civilization's progress, seen in advancements like art, science, technology, and ethics, relies heavily on this capacity to sublimate instinctual energy into collective endeavors. The creation of language, laws, and institutions all requires individuals to restrain selfish desires and transform them into behaviors that benefit the group. However, this essential process is not without psychological consequences. The cost of sublimation often emerges as neuroses, anxiety disorders, and various forms of psychological and societal dysfunction. Freud emphasized that recognizing this tension is crucial to addressing not only individual mental health struggles, but also the larger-scale social issues that stem from the demands of civilized life. A central insight in Freud's theory is the intricate link between an individual's psychological development and the evolution of culture. Each person must undergo a personal version of humanity's civilizing process, learning to regulate and redirect their primal drives in ways that align with societal norms. Successful navigation of this internal journey results in individuals who are capable of contributing to the collective advancement of civilization. Conversely, those who fail to effectively sublimate their impulses may struggle to adapt to society, potentially exhibiting antisocial behavior, mental illness, or general dysfunction. On the other hand, Freud also warned that when civilization imposes excessive demands, requiring too much suppression of instinctual needs, it can cause its own set of psychological disturbances. In some cases, both individuals and entire cultures may benefit from a more open acceptance of natural human instincts, rather than constant attempts to repress or sublimate them. The right balance between self-expression and cultural expectation is not universal. It varies from person to person and changes over time. Gaining insight into these dynamics is key to understanding both private emotional challenges and collective movements that aim to reshape societal norms. Religious and ethical systems have long played a pivotal role in supporting the sublimation process by offering belief structures that give purpose to instinctual renunciation. Through religious practices, individuals are often encouraged to redirect sexual and aggressive energies towards spiritual fulfillment or altruistic service. Similarly, moral frameworks offer blueprints for converting selfish drives into ethical actions that contribute to social well-being. Yet Freud recognized that these systems, while necessary, can also become sources of psychological strain. When religious teachings demand extreme denial of basic human needs, they may foster neurotic guilt or dysfunction, particularly around sexuality. Strict moral codes, too, can lead to compulsive behaviors and emotional rigidity, undermining spontaneity and authentic human connection. The key lies in developing spiritual and ethical approaches that support healthy sublimation while avoiding the pitfalls of excessive repression. For Freud, understanding the psychological role of religion and morality was not just a matter of personal therapy, it was essential for analyzing how societies shape and sometimes distort human development. In the context of modern life, particularly in technologically advanced societies, new challenges to sublimation have emerged, ones Freud could only begin to imagine. Digital platforms now offer unprecedented ways to channel creative energy through virtual art, online communities, and social media. However, these same technologies also offer instant gratification, which may undercut the patience and discipline required for mature sublimation. Video games and digital forms of entertainment offer an instant outlet for aggressive and competitive urges, often bypassing the need for discipline, skill building, or the delayed gratification that traditional forms of sublimation demand. In a similar vein, consumer culture promotes the immediate fulfillment of desires through consumption, rather than encouraging the creative redirection of these drives that sublimation entails. To grasp the implications of these modern dynamics, Freudian theory must be reinterpreted in light of present-day psychological and societal contexts. While Freud's core idea that basic instincts must be redirected into constructive channels remains deeply relevant, the avenues through which this transformation occurs are continually reshaped by cultural shifts. Strategies aimed at fostering psychological well-being and shaping effective social policy must take into account how today's environment either supports or obstructs the processes that enable healthy sublimation. Part 11. Case Studies and Clinical Applications. Freud's groundbreaking theories were largely the result of his deep involvement in one-on-one clinical practice. His encounters with patients who exhibited complex psychological issues, often resistant to traditional medical treatment, prompted him to rethink the nature of mental illness. These real-world cases became the bedrock of psychoanalytic theory, offering vivid examples of how unconscious conflicts surface through psychological disorders. In addition to shaping theoretical developments, these case studies highlighted the dynamics of the therapeutic process. They showed how individuals could gain awareness of their unconscious motivations, leading to improved psychological health. Among the most influential were the cases of Anna O., who was central to the origins of the talking cure, Little Hans, who suffered from a debilitating horse phobia, Dora, whose case involved hysteria, and the Rat Man, who exhibited obsessive-compulsive behaviors. Each case shed light on specific psychological mechanisms while illustrating the intricate relationships between early life experiences, repressed emotions, and adult mental health symptoms. These clinical narratives became essential tools in the education of future psychoanalysts, serving not only as theoretical illustrations, but also as practical examples of how Freudian principles could be applied in therapeutic environments. The story of Anna O., later identified as Bertha Pappenheim, is often regarded as the prototype of psychoanalytic treatment. Though her therapy was initiated by Freud's colleague Joseph Breuer, her case had a profound impact on Freud's evolving views on hysteria and the healing potential of verbal expression. Anna O developed a variety of conversion symptoms, including paralysis, speech impairment, and visual disturbances, in the aftermath of her father's illness and death. Her physical symptoms defied medical explanation and appeared instead to be linked to emotional trauma. Brewer found that when Anna was able to recall and articulate the memories tied to her symptoms, those symptoms would temporarily vanish. She famously referred to this process as the talking cure or chimney sweeping, recognizing the emotional relief it brought her. This case made clear that such symptoms were not random, but were meaningful expressions of unresolved inner conflicts. Furthermore, it highlighted the phenomenon of transference. Anna developed intense romantic feelings for Brewer, reflecting unresolved emotions from her relationship with her father. The case of Little Hans marked Freud's first comprehensive exploration of child psychology and demonstrated how neurotic patterns in adulthood could be traced back to childhood conflicts. At just 5 years old, Hans developed a severe fear of horses, which became so intense that he was afraid to leave his home. Under Freud's guidance, the analysis was carried out primarily by the boy's father. The origin of Hans's phobia was found to lie in deep-seated unconscious fears related to the Oedipus complex and castration anxiety. Having seen a horse fall and be beaten, Hans unconsciously linked these events with his own internal fears, particularly those involving guilt and punishment for his sexual feelings toward his mother. In his mind, the horses represented his father, a figure he both admired and viewed as a rival for his mother's attention. The phobia functioned on several unconscious levels, allowing Hans to express his repressed hostility toward his father while sidestepping the fear of direct retribution. The resolution of Hans's phobia, through careful interpretation of these underlying conflicts, provided compelling support for Freud's Oedipal theory and demonstrated the value of psychoanalytic intervention in childhood cases. This study also underscored the potential for parents to learn how to recognize and respond constructively to the psychological struggles of their children. The case of Dora, an 18-year-old diagnosed with conversion hysteria, serves as a profound example of how sexual trauma, familial dynamics, and neurotic symptom development are deeply interconnected. Dora exhibited a range of unexplained physical ailments, such as chronic coughing, episodes of mutism, and sudden fainting, that defied any clear medical diagnosis. These symptoms were intricately linked to unwanted sexual advances by Herr K., a close associate of her family, as well as to the tangled relationships surrounding her father's extramarital involvement with Herr K.'s wife. Freud's psychoanalytic investigation uncovered how Dora's psychosomatic symptoms reflected inner turmoil regarding her emerging sexuality, feelings of betrayal by the adults in her life, and unconscious identification with key figures in her family narrative. Yet, this case also underscored some of the shortcomings of early psychoanalytic methods. Dora abruptly ended her treatment after Freud offered premature interpretations of her unconscious desires and conflicts, highlighting the risks of moving too quickly in therapeutic exploration. This premature termination emphasized the crucial role of timing and sensitivity in psychoanalytic work. Building a strong therapeutic alliance and establishing trust are essential before introducing potentially distressing insights about unconscious motivations. Dora's story also brought to the fore critical questions about the analyst's responsibilities in handling cases that involve real instances of sexual abuse. It called attention to the delicate balance between examining internal psychological mechanisms and validating the reality of trauma or exploitation. Contemporary critics have pointed out Freud's tendency to downplay the factual basis of Dora's abuse in favor of emphasizing her repressed fantasies and intrapsychic conflicts. Another pivotal case, the so-called Rat Man, provided an in-depth look into the nature of obsessive-compulsive neurosis. This young attorney suffered from horrifying intrusive thoughts about a gruesome torture device involving rats burrowing into a person's body, which became the core of his obsessive fears. These obsessions, along with compulsive rituals, severely disrupted his professional life and personal relationships. Freud's analysis revealed that the rat imagery symbolized unresolved tensions related to money, sexual anxieties, and emotional ambivalence toward his deceased father. Interestingly, the German word for rat also connoted installments or financial payments, thus linking the obsession to inherited financial obligations and internal conflicts between filial duty and the desire for independence. The anal fixation in the torture fantasy symbolized deeper issues around control, submission, and repressed homosexual impulses. By tracing the patient's associations and exploring the personal and developmental roots of his symptoms, Freud was able to demonstrate how seemingly irrational and disturbing obsessions were grounded in meaningful psychological processes. The case showed that even the most bizarre symptoms could be alleviated through uncovering their symbolic significance and helping the patient confront the underlying emotional issues. Freud's views on human sexuality evolved considerably over the course of his career as he sought to unravel the complexities of sexual drives in both psychological development and psychopathology. In his early work, he maintained that neuroses were primarily caused by real instances of sexual trauma or frustration in adult life. Over time, however, his clinical findings led him to recognize the pivotal role of unconscious fantasies and internal sexual conflicts in the genesis of neurotic symptoms. His groundbreaking theory of infantile sexuality, which shocked the conservative values of the time, became foundational to psychoanalysis. Freud proposed that sexual impulses are present from birth and undergo a series of developmental transformations, culminating in mature genital sexuality during adulthood. Disruptions at any stage of this psychosexual progression could result in lasting fixations, shaping adult personality traits and sexual behaviors. Freud's approach to homosexuality, while reflective of the cultural biases of his era, attempted to understand it within a scientific framework rather than moral judgment. He regarded homosexuality as a variation in development, often linked to unresolved issues during the Oedipal phase. Despite these views, Freud opposed criminalization and advocated for more compassionate and accepting social attitudes toward individuals with same-sex attraction. Freud increasingly recognized bisexuality as a foundational element in understanding human sexual development and the emergence of neurotic conflicts. He proposed that every individual inherently contains both masculine and feminine psychological traits. For healthy psychological growth, these dual aspects must be harmoniously integrated. However, when societal norms compel individuals to deny or repress one side of this inner duality, psychological distress often follows. Such repression, Freud argued, generates inner turmoil that can lead to neurotic symptoms. This framework offered a way to understand why both men and women might experience sexual dysfunctions and relational difficulties when their intrinsic psychological complexity is stifled. Nevertheless, Freud's theories regarding female sexuality, while groundbreaking in some respects, remained deeply controversial and bore the imprints of the patriarchal attitudes of his time. His concepts, most notably penis envy and female masochism, have drawn sharp criticism from feminist theorists, who argue that these ideas pathologize normative female experiences and neglect the social conditions contributing to women's mental health challenges. Despite these criticisms, Freud's core insight that sexual conflicts are central to psychological development continues to shape modern understandings of sexuality and mental well-being. Today's sex therapy and relationship counseling frequently incorporate psychoanalytic principles, especially those related to the influence of unconscious processes and early developmental experiences on adult sexual behavior and intimacy. Freud's exploration of group psychology marked a significant expansion of psychoanalytic theory beyond individual therapy, allowing for a deeper understanding of collective human behavior. He noted that individuals often act differently within groups, displaying heightened emotional responses, diminished rationality, and increased openness to the influence of powerful leaders. To explain these behaviors, Freud introduced the ideas of identification and regression. He theorized that group membership reactivates early psychological mechanisms from childhood, where individuals identify with the leader as a symbolic father figure and see fellow group members as sibling rivals seeking parental validation. This dynamic temporarily merges individual identities into a shared group psyche governed by instinctual rather than reasoned processes. Such a perspective has helped illuminate the psychological underpinnings of phenomena like religious fervor, political rallies, and mass hysteria, events that often resist logical analysis. Freud's insights have also proven useful in practical contexts, aiding in the management of group dynamics within therapeutic settings, educational environments, and organizational structures. However, his theory of group behavior has been critiqued for mirroring the elitist worldview of his era and for potentially reinforcing hierarchical or authoritarian models of social organization, rather than fostering democratic values and personal agency. The clinical reach of psychoanalytic theory eventually extended well beyond traditional neuroses, shaping the understanding of personality disorders, psychotic disturbances, and various other psychological challenges. Character analysis emerged as a vital approach for treating persistent personality patterns that cause ongoing life disruptions rather than isolated symptoms. Addressing conditions such as narcissistic and borderline personality disorders required adaptations to classical psychoanalytic methods, as these disorders involved unique developmental impairments and defensive structures. Freud's approach to psychosis emphasized profound regression and the withdrawal of emotional energy from the external world back into the self. This conceptualization encouraged more compassionate and less adversarial treatment strategies for those experiencing severe mental illness. Simultaneously, the development of child analysis applied psychoanalytic principles to the psychological treatment of children, helping to identify and address mental health issues early in life. These diverse applications showcase both the versatility and the boundaries of psychoanalytic theory, highlighting its relevance across a wide range of psychological conditions, while also underscoring the need for continual refinement and evolution. Today, psychoanalysis continues to develop as practitioners integrate emerging research, address ongoing critiques, and uphold the foundational belief in the importance of unconscious drives and early relational experiences in shaping the human psyche. Part 12. Legacy, Evolution, and Contemporary Significance. Freud's intellectual influence reaches far beyond psychology, leaving a profound mark on literature, art, anthropology, sociology, and mainstream culture. His foundational ideas, particularly regarding unconscious motivations, the lasting effects of early childhood experiences, and the centrality of sexuality in psychological growth, have become so embedded in modern thought that many people accept them as common sense, unaware of their Freudian roots. Despite this widespread acceptance, numerous elements of his original theories have been questioned, revised, or outright dismissed in light of evolving research and clinical insights. The development of psychoanalytic theory reflects both the lasting relevance of Freud's key contributions and the necessity of continual adaptation in response to new evidence and shifting societal contexts. To fully grasp his legacy, one must consider both the enduring aspects of his work and the areas where more modern frameworks have replaced his views on mental health and human behavior. There remains an ongoing tension between honoring Freud's revolutionary contributions and addressing the limitations inherent in his work. This dynamic continues to influence contemporary discussions within psychology and related disciplines. Throughout his career, Freud consistently reevaluated and reworked his theories in response to clinical findings and theoretical developments. Initially, he emphasized real-life sexual trauma as the root of neurosis, but later shifted his focus to internal fantasies and unconscious conflicts when he recognized that patients' recollections were not always factually accurate. This transition from a simplistic topographical model, distinguishing between conscious and unconscious mind, to the more nuanced structural model of the id, ego, and superego marked a deepening of his understanding of psychological development and inner conflict. Moreover, Freud's early focus on sexual instincts eventually broadened to include aggressive impulses, culminating in his dual theory of life and death drives, which tackled existential dimensions of human behavior. These theoretical shifts highlight Freud's intellectual integrity and his readiness to revise previous assumptions when faced with contradictory clinical evidence. Nonetheless, critics argue that some of these changes may have been influenced more by personal convictions or prevailing cultural norms than by objective scientific analysis. After Freud's death, psychoanalytic theory continued to evolve, undergoing further refinements while retaining its core emphasis on unconscious processes. Tracing these developments provides insight into the theory's adaptability and also into its limitations as a model for understanding the human psyche. The question of whether psychoanalysis qualifies as a scientific discipline remains contentious. Detractors argue that many Freudian concepts are not empirically testable, making them scientifically problematic. Philosopher Karl Popper famously criticized psychoanalysis for being unfalsifiable. Its claims, he argued, are so elastic that no experimental result could disprove them. Others have noted that Freud's theories often stemmed from small, unrepresentative samples, limiting their broader applicability. Moreover, the relative lack of controlled studies demonstrating the efficacy of psychoanalytic therapy compared to alternative treatments has led some to question its practical value. Nonetheless, proponents assert that psychoanalysis deals with intricate psychological phenomena that defy reduction to straightforward experimental designs. They maintain that rich clinical narratives and detailed case analyses serve as valid, though different, forms of evidence that cannot be substituted by purely quantitative methods. Recent findings in neuroscience and attachment theory have lent empirical support to some psychoanalytic principles while simultaneously challenging others. These scientific developments illustrate both the relevance and the limits of Freud's original insights. Ultimately, the debate over the scientific legitimacy of psychoanalysis mirrors deeper philosophical questions about how best to study the human mind and the appropriate balance between empirical research and clinical experience. Feminist scholars have long contested Freudian views of female psychology, arguing that ideas such as penis envy and inherent female masochism stem more from patriarchal ideology than from objective scientific inquiry. These critiques emphasize that Freud's conclusions were largely shaped by his work with male patients and abstract theorizing, rather than by rigorous empirical studies focused on women's psychological development. Rather than acknowledging the influence of social structures and cultural expectations, Freud attributed women's psychological challenges to supposed anatomical inferiority or incomplete psychosexual maturation. Feminist theorists contend that this perspective overlooks how societal norms and gendered experiences contribute to differences in mental health outcomes. In response, many have proposed alternative psychological frameworks that highlight the significance of relational dynamics and contextual factors in women's development. Nonetheless, some feminist psychoanalysts have chosen not to dismiss Freud's legacy entirely. Instead, they have reinterpreted and restructured psychoanalytic theory, aiming to preserve valuable insights into the unconscious mind while removing the sexist assumptions embedded within the original models. These efforts have fostered a more nuanced understanding of how gender identity forms and how social hierarchies shape psychological experiences. The feminist re-examination of psychoanalysis has spurred greater awareness of how cultural prejudices can distort scientific thought, reinforcing the necessity of diverse viewpoints in psychological research. As a result, modern psychoanalytic theory has moved away from the most outdated and controversial elements of Freud's gender theories, while retaining key principles regarding the unconscious and developmental psychology. Critics from both cultural and cross-cultural perspectives have highlighted that many foundational Freudian concepts are deeply rooted in Western, middle-class ideologies, making them less applicable to individuals from non-Western or less conventional backgrounds. For example, Freud's emphasis on the individual psyche and nuclear family dynamics does not translate easily to cultures with communal family structures or differing gender norms. Psychoanalytic constructs like the Oedipus complex may hold little relevance in societies where extended families are central to child rearing, or where gender roles diverge significantly from those of early 20th century Europe. Furthermore, some scholars argue that the psychoanalytic focus on inner psychological turmoil can overshadow the impact of social inequality, economic stress, and structural oppression on mental well-being. Despite these critiques, psychoanalytic ideas have been meaningfully adapted across various cultural contexts, indicating that certain insights into unconscious mechanisms and psychological growth may hold cross-cultural value. In response, contemporary psychoanalysts have increasingly prioritized cultural awareness and work toward developing theories and practices that are more attuned to diverse worldviews. The ongoing task for theorists is to discern which psychological patterns are truly universal and which are specific to particular cultural settings. This challenge has not only refined psychoanalytic theory, but also deepened our broader comprehension of how cultural frameworks shape mental health and human development. Meanwhile, advances in neuroscience have provided partial but important validation of Freudian principles. Some neuroimaging studies support the existence of unconscious mental processes, affirming Freud's foundational notion that much of our mental life occurs outside of conscious awareness. Additionally, research on trauma and memory has demonstrated that distressing experiences can be suppressed or dissociated, later influencing behavior without explicit memory recall. Findings in attachment theory and early brain development also support the Freudian view that early childhood experiences play a critical role in shaping personality and emotional well-being. However, neuroscience has found little evidence for more specific Freudian constructs, such as the Oedipus complex or discrete stages of psychosexual development, challenging the literal accuracy of some of Freud's more detailed propositions. The connection between neural activity and psychological experience appears to be more intricate and less directly causal than what early psychoanalytic models once proposed. While findings in this area remain varied, many neuroscientists now recognize that Freud's emphasis on unconscious processes and formative early life experiences anticipated insights that neuroscience would only begin to validate many years after his death. As both neuroscience and psychoanalysis continue to advance, there is a growing convergence in understanding how biological and psychological systems interact to shape human development and mental disorders. This ongoing integration reflects increasingly nuanced models that bridge mind and brain. Modern therapeutic practices have been deeply shaped by psychoanalytic thinking, even among approaches that reject specific Freudian methods or theoretical frameworks. Core elements such as the centrality of the therapeutic alliance, the influence of unconscious dynamics, and the lasting effects of early experiences are evident across a wide array of psychotherapeutic modalities. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, incorporates concepts of unconscious cognition, even as it employs more structured, evidence-based techniques. Similarly, humanistic therapies like client-centered therapy adopt the psychoanalytic emphasis on the healing relationship, but favor empathy and validation over interpretation or analysis. Family systems therapy draws from psychoanalytic ideas about the impact of early relational patterns on personality, yet shifts the focus to present-day family interactions rather than internal psychic conflicts. Even brief and time-limited therapies often retain adapted versions of psychoanalytic concepts like transference and resistance, repurposing them for shorter-term treatment goals. This widespread adoption illustrates how foundational psychoanalytic insights have endured even as they are separated from outdated or disproven theoretical assumptions. The field of psychotherapy continues to evolve by balancing the enduring value of psychoanalytic principles with innovations from contemporary research and practice. This reflects an effort to preserve what remains clinically useful while discarding what no longer aligns with modern understanding or empirical support. Freudian concepts have also left a lasting mark on popular culture, profoundly influencing everyday thinking about psychology, relationships, and motivation. Terms such as unconscious, repression, Freudian slip, and defense mechanism have become part of common speech, frequently used by individuals with little or no formal knowledge of psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalytic themes are often explored in literature, film, and television, where they help explain character motivations and internal struggles. The idea that childhood experiences play a critical role in shaping adult personality has been widely embraced, both in popular discourse and in common parenting advice. However, the public's understanding of Freudian theory is often simplistic or inaccurate, straying far from the complexities of formal psychoanalytic thought. The cultural diffusion of these concepts reflects their broad intuitive appeal and explanatory usefulness, while also highlighting how scientific ideas can be distorted through popular interpretation. Analyzing how formal psychoanalytic theory compares with its cultural expressions helps to clarify both its enduring strengths and its limitations. The persistent presence of these ideas in modern culture indicates that they touch on deep, universal concerns about human behavior and inner life, maintaining relevance even amid theoretical disputes. Looking forward, the ongoing significance of Freud's contributions will depend in part on how well they are integrated with newer approaches to understanding the human mind. Advances in fields such as genetics, neuroscience, and social psychology continue to offer fresh insights into the kinds of issues Freud explored through clinical practice and theoretical reflection. Rather than viewing these disciplines as mutually exclusive or in competition, modern scholars are increasingly acknowledging the unique yet complementary roles that diverse psychological approaches play in deepening our understanding of the human mind. Biological research sheds light on the brain-based mechanisms that drive psychological activity, while psychoanalytic theory offers valuable interpretations of the inner meaning and developmental roots of those processes. At the same time, social psychology investigates the ways in which cultural contexts and interpersonal relationships shape mental development. Psychoanalysis contributes further by analyzing how these external social and cultural forces are absorbed and transformed into internal psychological structures. By combining these multiple layers of analysis, a more nuanced and comprehensive picture of human psychology emerges, one that no single framework could achieve on its own. Yet, this synthesis demands a thoughtful examination of what each perspective offers, including their respective strengths and limitations. Achieving such integration also calls for consistent, open dialogue among theorists, researchers, and clinicians from a wide range of psychological backgrounds. The enduring relevance of Freudian thought ultimately hinges on its capacity to inform and enrich this broader collaborative effort to expand our understanding of the human psyche in all its complexity, variation, and depth. Part 13. Transference and Counter-transference. Transference stands as one of Freud's most pivotal insights into the dynamics of human relationships, and ultimately became the cornerstone of psychoanalytic therapy. This phenomenon arises when individuals unknowingly project emotions, attitudes, and relational patterns from important past relationships onto their therapist in the present therapeutic context. Rather than engaging with the analyst as a unique person in the here and now, patients instead relate to them as if they were key figures from their past, typically caregivers or others from formative stages of life. Freud initially perceived this as a hindrance to therapeutic progress, believing it to be a distraction from addressing the patient's actual psychological concerns. Over time, however, he came to understand that transference reactions offer a direct window into unconscious emotional templates and unresolved developmental conflicts. Within the therapeutic setting, transference transforms the relationship into a dynamic arena where long-standing psychological patterns can be experienced, examined, and ultimately worked through. This process enables patients to confront issues rooted in their earliest interpersonal attachments. The unfolding of transference typically follows identifiable patterns shaped by each individual's relational history and inner psychological makeup. At the start of treatment, many patients perceive their therapist as a benevolent authority, someone who holds special insight and the power to heal. This early phase, known as positive transference, plays a vital role in helping patients commit to therapy and engage deeply in the challenging process of self-exploration. As therapy delves into more distressing and vulnerable material, the nature of transference often shifts. Patients may begin to experience the analyst as critical, rejecting, manipulative, or seductive, reactions that stem from earlier experiences with parents or other influential figures. These responses feel entirely authentic and justified to the patient, even when they are inconsistent with the therapist's actual behavior or personality. The intensity of transference highlights the enduring influence of past experiences on present-day emotional life. It also illustrates how unconscious relational patterns tend to repeat across different situations and relationships. Grasping the mechanics of transference is therefore essential to understanding why people often face recurring interpersonal difficulties, even with new partners or in varied contexts. Positive transference is marked by the patient's idealization of the therapist, seeing them as perfectly wise, compassionate, and uniquely understanding. Patients may feel deeply seen, believing that the therapist offers a level of care and acceptance they have never received elsewhere. While this idealization can foster a strong therapeutic alliance, it may also lead to complications. Patients might develop excessive dependence or hold unrealistic expectations about what the therapy can provide. In some cases, individuals resist ending therapy out of fear that they cannot function without the therapist's support. Others may experience disillusionment or even anger upon recognizing that the therapist is a fallible human being, not the flawless caregiver they longed for in childhood. Addressing positive transference often involves guiding patients to identify and understand their patterns of idealization and dependency. The objective is not to dismantle the therapeutic bond, but to help patients cultivate more grounded and realistic expectations in their relationships. Learning to accept imperfection within the therapeutic relationship ultimately equips patients to navigate real-world relationships with greater resilience and emotional maturity. This shift allows them to move beyond the need for perfect love, opening the door to more satisfying, authentic connections with others. Negative transference arises when patients begin to perceive their therapist as disapproving, withholding, punishing, or emotionally distant. They may come to believe that the therapist dislikes them, is overly judgmental, or is intentionally depriving them of support or understanding. These reactions often mirror early interactions with caregivers who were genuinely critical or rejecting. Despite the analyst's consistent support, such projections can feel just as vivid and real to the patient. This form of transference can be profoundly challenging for both the patient and the therapist, as it often involves intense and distressing emotions. Patients may express anger, become confrontational, or emotionally withdraw, all while continuing to rely on their therapist for psychological support. In some cases, patients may even act in ways that invite rejection, seeking to validate their belief that close relationships inevitably lead to hurt, disappointment, or abandonment. Successfully navigating negative transference requires the therapist to possess both emotional resilience and clinical expertise. Even while being emotionally attacked or dismissed, the therapist must remain grounded, objective, and therapeutically engaged. Despite its difficulty, negative transference is often among the most revealing aspects of therapy, offering direct insight into the patient's deepest anxieties and most deeply rooted defense mechanisms. Erotic transference, on the other hand, occurs when patients develop romantic or sexual feelings toward their therapist. These feelings may vary from mild attraction to overwhelming infatuation that becomes central to the patient's inner world. Often, erotic transference reflects an unconscious effort to revisit and resolve unresolved Oedipal conflicts from childhood. The therapist may come to represent an idealized parental figure the patient once longed to possess during their early psychosexual development. While the emotional pull of erotic transference can be powerful and consuming, it is essential to understand that such feelings are not grounded in realistic romantic potential, but instead represent unmet childhood wishes. The therapist's role is to uphold professional boundaries while guiding the patient toward an understanding of the psychological origins and meaning of their romantic fantasies. Exploring erotic transference can yield crucial insights into a patient's sexual history, patterns of attachment, and overall ability to form meaningful emotional bonds. It may help patients recognize how they use romantic or sexual energy as a defense against deeper emotional vulnerability, or how they replicate dysfunctional relationship patterns across various contexts in their lives. Analyzing transference, whether negative or erotic, involves carefully attending to both the patient's conscious experiences and the underlying unconscious processes driving them. Therapists look for recurring relational patterns that emerge across different sessions and situations. They pay special attention when the patient's emotional responses seem disproportionate to the actual therapeutic context. To deepen the patient's understanding, therapists often use what are known as genetic interpretations, connections drawn between current transference reactions and formative childhood relationships. For example, a patient's fear of being judged in therapy may be traced back to a hypercritical parent, or their constant need for reassurance may stem from early emotional neglect. These interpretations help illuminate how past relational experiences continue to shape current behaviors and emotional responses, often without the patient's conscious awareness. However, insight alone rarely brings about lasting change. True therapeutic progress requires the patient not only to intellectually understand these dynamics, but also to emotionally engage with and work through them within the therapeutic relationship. Countertransference refers to the therapist's emotional responses to the patient, which were once regarded as obstacles to be eliminated through personal therapy and professional training. Sigmund Freud emphasized the importance of the analyst maintaining emotional detachment to prevent personal biases from interfering with treatment. However, later developments in psychoanalytic theory recognize that the therapist's emotional reactions can, in fact, offer meaningful information about the patient's inner world. The feelings evoked in the therapist often reflect how the patient unconsciously impacts those around them in everyday life. For instance, a therapist who feels emotionally disengaged may be mirroring the patient's habitual use of emotional distance as a defense. Likewise, if the therapist experiences irritation or frustration, it may be a sign that the patient is unconsciously provoking rejection or punishment. Understanding countertransference requires therapists to stay attuned to their own emotional states while carefully separating personal issues from reactions that hold diagnostic value. This dual awareness allows therapists to use their emotional responses as clinical tools, offering deeper understanding into the patient's relational patterns and psychological functioning. Effectively working with countertransference demands a deep commitment to personal psychoanalysis and continuous supervision. This ensures that the analyst's emotional responses are employed in the service of the patient's therapeutic progress, rather than being driven by the analyst's own unresolved needs. Navigating the complexities of transference and countertransference stands as one of the most intricate challenges in psychoanalytic work. The analyst must remain emotionally attuned and receptive to the patient's projections, while also upholding firm psychological boundaries. This delicate balance helps prevent the analyst from becoming emotionally entangled or reacting impulsively. They must be capable of withstanding being idealized, criticized, seduced, or ignored, without retaliating or disengaging from the therapeutic process. Maintaining this equilibrium calls for significant emotional maturity and a high level of professional training. Transference dynamics can easily activate the analyst's own unconscious material, and managing such responses without disrupting the treatment requires a seasoned understanding of the therapeutic frame. It is also crucial for the analyst to assess when and how to address these transference patterns. The timing and approach to interpretation must be carefully calibrated to enhance therapeutic progress while avoiding the induction of undue anxiety or defensive resistance. If transference interpretations are introduced too early, there is a risk of alienating the patient or disrupting the therapeutic alliance. Conversely, if such interpretations are delayed too long, maladaptive relational patterns may become further entrenched. Crafting and delivering transference interpretations requires clinical acumen that is honed through years of focused training and close supervision. When done skillfully, The analysis of transference can become the cornerstone of the therapeutic journey, providing profound insights into the patient's relational world. Resolving transference issues often yields the most transformative changes in psychoanalytic treatment. As patients begin to unpack and explore the nature of their transference relationships, they cultivate deeper self-understanding and gain a clearer, more balanced view of others. They start to differentiate between historical relationships and current ones, gradually recognizing how unconscious expectations shape their present interactions. This work frequently involves significant emotional pain, as patients relinquish idealized fantasies of perfect or all-powerful relationships and begin to acknowledge the inherent imperfections of real human connections. Yet this mourning process, while difficult, paves the way for greater emotional flexibility and the ability to engage in more authentic, rewarding relationships. Those who are able to fully process their transference experiences often notice meaningful improvements in how they relate to partners, friends, and family members. They become less inclined to repeat harmful relational patterns and more adept at forming bonds grounded in reality rather than distorted by unconscious projections. In this way, transference analysis offers a powerful therapeutic avenue, one that addresses the deep-rooted interpersonal origins of emotional suffering rather than merely alleviating surface-level symptoms. Part 14. The Pleasure Principle versus the Reality Principle. Sigmund Freud's distinction between the pleasure principle and the reality principle is one of his most foundational insights into the functioning and development of the human psyche. These two internal forces are in constant tension, shaping how individuals develop morally, psychologically, and socially, and influencing how well they adapt to the demands of civilized life. The pleasure principle reflects an instinctual drive within the mind that seeks immediate satisfaction of needs and desires, without consideration for real-world consequences or ethical concerns. In contrast, the reality principle arises as part of psychological maturation, enabling individuals to delay gratification, think rationally, and respond to their environment in a more adaptive and socially appropriate manner. Understanding the dynamic interaction between these two forces is crucial to explaining both healthy psychological growth and the development of psychopathology when this balance becomes disrupted. While the ongoing struggle between instinctual pleasure-seeking and rational decision-making often occurs beneath conscious awareness, it deeply affects every aspect of human behavior, from daily choices to long-term goals. The pleasure principle is dominant from birth, shaping an infant's behavior by driving the immediate relief of discomfort and the fulfillment of basic needs. It compels individuals to seek instant reduction of tension, regardless of whether circumstances allow for it. In early infancy, this mode of functioning is all-encompassing. Newborns react to hunger, cold, or discomfort with demands for immediate resolution, unable to recognize or respond to delays or limitations. At this stage, the mind operates using what Freud termed primary process thinking, a primitive form of mental activity based on wish fulfillment, symbolic imagery, and emotional logic rather than rational thought. This way of thinking does not acknowledge contradictions, does not track time, and pays no attention to the feasibility of its desires. Under the influence of the pleasure principle, the psyche treats desires as though they have already been fulfilled, often resorting to fantasy to create an illusion of satisfaction when real gratification is not possible. Dreams, in Freud's theory, represent the clearest manifestation of the pleasure principle at work, offering a realm in which any wish can be fulfilled without interference from the external world. Over time, the reality principle begins to emerge as children encounter limitations in their environment and experience repeated instances where immediate satisfaction is not provided. This developmental shift occurs as the ego matures, gradually learning to navigate frustration and to think ahead before acting on impulses. The child's interactions with caregivers, who cannot always satisfy every need instantly, become essential in this process, as do the natural boundaries set by the environment, which limit unrestrained gratification. As this process unfolds, children develop the ability to endure discomfort and to wait for more appropriate or fulfilling outcomes in the future. This marks the emergence of secondary process thinking, a more advanced cognitive mode that uses logical reasoning, respects the passage of time, and considers external factors when making decisions. Such mental functioning allows for effective problem solving, long-term planning, and adaptive responses to challenges, all of which enhance the likelihood of achieving realistic goals. Importantly, the rise of the reality principle does not eliminate the influence of the pleasure principle. Rather, it redirects and refines it. The desire for pleasure remains, but the strategies used to attain it become more sophisticated and grounded in reality. The fundamental aim, to satisfy one's drives, persists, but the approach evolves to be more measured and socially acceptable. Developing the capacity to function under the reality principle requires the ego to become strong enough to handle the discomfort and anxiety that come with delayed gratification. Young children often struggle with this because their ability to manage emotions is still maturing and their thinking remains concrete and limited. Outbursts such as tantrums often signify the failure of the reality principle to assert itself when the demands of the pleasure principle become overwhelming. Successfully acquiring this capacity depends on consistent and supportive caregiving. When children feel emotionally secure and experience caregivers who set firm yet compassionate boundaries, they become more capable of enduring frustration. This sense of security helps them internalize the belief that their needs will eventually be met, allowing them to tolerate temporary discomfort and further strengthening their ability to manage reality-based challenges. Individuals who grow up with inconsistent or unreliable caregivers may face challenges in developing the psychological capacity known as reality principle functioning. This difficulty arises because they learn not to expect that postponing gratification will lead to eventual fulfillment. In such cases, delayed rewards feel uncertain or unattainable. Additionally, early exposure to trauma or intense stress can further disrupt this developmental pathway by overwhelming the child's emerging ability to regulate emotions and think rationally. These insights are crucial for understanding why some people continue to struggle with self-control and the ability to delay gratification well into adulthood. The inner conflict between the pleasure principle and the reality principle reveals itself in distinct ways depending on a person's psychological makeup and the nature of their mental health issues. In psychotic disorders, there is often a regression to functioning governed primarily by the pleasure principle, resulting in a profound distortion of reality. Individuals may behave as though their fantasies are real or make choices driven by desire rather than logic or practicality. Episodes of mania often illustrate a temporary dominance of pleasure-driven thinking. During these periods, people may relentlessly chase immediate pleasure or excitement, disregarding potential negative outcomes. On the other hand, certain neurotic disorders lean heavily on the reality principle, leading to rigid and emotionally constrained personalities. In such cases, spontaneity and joy may be sacrificed in the name of control or duty. For example, individuals with obsessive-compulsive traits may become excessively preoccupied with managing every detail of their environment. This compulsive control can disconnect them from their authentic feelings and desires. In contrast, mental wellness involves a dynamic and adaptive balance between these two guiding principles. The healthiest psychological functioning allows a person to seek enjoyment in appropriate circumstances while also applying sound judgment when it is needed. The ability to experience joy and act spontaneously without losing touch with reality reflects a well-developed and mature psyche. Sublimation is considered the most refined strategy for harmonizing the demands of the pleasure and reality principles. This psychological mechanism transforms raw, instinctual drives into constructive and socially meaningful pursuits. In doing so, it allows for partial gratification of underlying impulses while also contributing to personal growth and societal progress. For instance, someone with aggressive tendencies might find fulfillment as a surgeon, where the act of cutting, once a primitive urge, serves a healing and socially sanctioned purpose. Similarly, a person with intense sexual energy might channel that passion into the creation of art, allowing for expression within the bounds of cultural and moral norms. In this way, sublimation enables the satisfaction of primal urges through pathways that align with reality, benefiting both the individual and the broader community. Freud argued that some of civilization's highest achievements in areas like art, science, and culture stem from the successful sublimation of basic psychological instincts. Yet this transformation demands a certain level of psychological maturity and creativity. Not everyone has the inner resources, such as ego strength and imaginative capacity, required to redirect instinctual drives into productive outlets. When this transformation does not occur, unresolved tensions may persist between the desire for immediate gratification and the pressures to conform to societal expectations. The pleasure principle continues to shape adult behavior in powerful and often unconscious ways. Modern consumer culture capitalizes on this by promoting instant gratification, encouraging purchases that bring fleeting pleasure but can lead to long-term financial stress. At its most extreme, addiction highlights the dominance of the pleasure principle, where individuals compulsively seek immediate chemical relief, even when it severely undermines their health, relationships, and life ambitions. Even among psychologically healthy individuals, impulses driven by the pleasure principle constantly contend with reality-based thinking. This internal conflict plays out in areas such as nutrition, physical activity, productivity, and personal relationships. Today's world presents far more opportunities for instant rewards than our psychological systems evolved to manage effectively. Technological advancements have made communication, entertainment, and access to information nearly instantaneous. While convenient, this environment can hinder the development of important psychological capacities like frustration, tolerance, and the ability to delay gratification. Gaining insight into these mechanisms sheds light on modern psychological issues and social patterns that are difficult to interpret without recognizing the persistent impact of these primal drives. As a result, many educational and therapeutic strategies are geared toward reinforcing the reality principle. These approaches aim to support individuals in making decisions that promote long-term well-being rather than acting on momentary desires. Recognizing the interaction between the pleasure and reality principles has profound implications for mental health treatment and informs a wide variety of therapeutic models. In psychoanalysis, therapy often involves helping patients become aware of how unconscious pleasure-seeking urges affect their conscious choices, sometimes leading to destructive habits. Cognitive behavioral methods, on the other hand, focus on developing skills such as reality testing and strategies for postponing gratification, both of which strengthen the reality principle. Dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, takes a more targeted approach by addressing challenges related to emotional regulation and impulsivity, areas where the reality principle may be underdeveloped. However, effective treatment must also account for valid emotional and pleasure-seeking needs that may have been neglected due to an overemphasis on practicality or external obligations. In some cases, psychological distress stems not from unchecked indulgence, but from a disconnection from authentic desires and emotional needs. Such individuals may have sacrificed their personal satisfaction in order to meet societal or familial expectations. Therapy in these instances may focus on helping clients rediscover what truly brings them joy and to pursue those experiences in balanced, healthy ways. The aim is not to eliminate the pursuit of pleasure, but to harmonize it with a commitment to achieving long-term goals and personal growth. Social and cultural contexts play a significant role in shaping how people navigate the tension between pleasure and reality. Different societies promote varying degrees of personal freedom versus collective duty, which in turn produce distinct psychological challenges. In cultures that prize immediate gratification and individual autonomy, people may struggle more with self-regulation and delaying impulses. Conversely, societies that prioritize discipline, sacrifice, and communal responsibility may foster individuals who are overly restrained and out of touch with their emotional needs. Economic factors also influence how the pleasure and reality principles develop. When individuals live in conditions of chronic scarcity or instability, they may be compelled to act on immediate opportunities for reward, which can hinder the development of long-term planning and self-control. Taking these broader influences into account is crucial for applying psychoanalytic understanding to societal and cultural dynamics. Ultimately, the tension between seeking pleasure and confronting reality is not just an internal psychological struggle, it is a foundational conflict that shapes both individual lives and the evolution of human civilizations. Part 15. The Life Drive versus the Death Drive. In the later stages of his work, Freud introduced a comprehensive theory involving two core psychological forces that shape all mental functions and drive human behavior throughout the lifespan. The first of these, known as Eros or the life drive, encompasses all impulses directed toward survival, reproduction, growth, and the integration of elements into more complex and unified systems. In contrast, the second force, Thanatos, or the death drive, embodies the desire for destruction, breakdown, and a return to the inorganic state that preceded the emergence of life. Freud formulated this dualistic framework after observing patients who repeatedly reenacted traumatic events and while trying to understand the psychological underpinnings of human aggression and tendencies toward self-harm. The interaction and opposition between these two drives form the basis of the inner psychological tensions that influence personality formation, social relationships, and the evolution of human culture at large. Grasping this theoretical model is crucial for interpreting behaviors that defy the pleasure principle, particularly those involving the repetition of distressing experiences or the inclination toward harmful or perilous actions. Eros is not limited to sexual desires, although sexuality plays a vital role in its expression. This life-affirming drive encompasses all psychological energies that support existence, expansion, and the creation of intricate mental and social structures. Biologically, Eros is evident in the drive to obtain food, water, shelter, and other essentials that sustain the physical body. On a psychological level, it reveals itself through curiosity, creativity, learning, and the longing for meaningful emotional bonds with others. Socially, Eros motivates the development of families, the formation of communities, and the construction of civilizations, all collective efforts that allow individuals to achieve what they could never accomplish alone. At its core, the life drive seeks to unify, to bring disparate elements together through love, attachment, and the act of creative integration. Whether it is artists blending color and form into visual harmony, scientists uncovering universal laws that bring coherence to diverse phenomena, or romantic partners merging their identities into shared intimacy, each reflects a distinct manifestation of eros. This drive supplies the vital psychological energy that fuels all positive, innovative, and developmental processes essential to healthy psychological growth. The sexual component of eros extends well beyond mere procreation, encompassing a wide range of experiences tied to pleasure, sensual gratification, and intimate emotional bonding. Freud proposed that sexual energy, or libido, serves as the central motivational force behind not only psychological development but also collaborative social behavior. His concept of sexuality, however, was expansive and not confined to physical acts. It included all pleasurable sensations and emotional experiences that contribute to vitality and growth. The pursuit of sensual enjoyment encourages individuals to engage in activities that elevate their sense of aliveness and well-being. Romantic and intimate relationships offer more than physical satisfaction. They provide emotional warmth, companionship, and the foundation for creating and nurturing new life. Even when redirected or sublimated, sexual energy fuels artistic expression, intellectual discovery, and spiritual exploration. Thus, the life drive encompasses an extensive spectrum, from the fundamental instinct to survive to the most refined expressions of human culture. Despite their diversity, these expressions all serve the same overarching aim: to support, enhance, and celebrate life in all its dimensions. By contrast, the concept of thanatos, the death drive, appeared to challenge Freud's earlier convictions about motivation and the dominance of the pleasure principle. His studies of soldiers returning from World War I, many of whom were trapped in cycles of traumatic recollection through dreams and compulsive behaviors, revealed the presence of a force seemingly indifferent to pleasure. These cases led Freud to acknowledge the existence of a profound psychological drive that acts counter to life, seeking regression, repetition, and ultimately, dissolution. Some individuals seem compelled to relive painful experiences, not in pursuit of pleasure or in an effort to avoid discomfort, but driven by a deeper psychological force. Over time, Freud came to understand that these compulsions to repeat suffering were not anomalies, but expressions of a more profound instinct, the death drive. This drive aims to eliminate psychological tension entirely by returning the psyche to an inanimate, inorganic state. The death drive reveals itself through both overt aggression directed at others and covert, self-sabotaging behaviors. These manifestations serve the ultimate purpose of silencing inner conflict and tension by extinguishing conscious awareness. In its most intense form, Thanatos, the personification of the death drive, seeks the total cessation of mental life, a regression to the undisturbed unconsciousness that existed before birth. Yet this drive does not only operate in catastrophic forms, it also surfaces in ordinary behaviors that strive for internal quietude. These include efforts to avoid stimulation, reject challenges, and achieve psychological balance through withdrawal rather than engagement. Freud's evolving understanding of the death drive shed light on why people sometimes act against their own interests, undermining personal success, remaining in harmful relationships, or engaging in reckless behavior that defies logical explanation. Among its most visible expressions is aggression, especially when directed outwardly toward others or objects in the external world. Freud moved away from the belief that aggression is simply a reaction to frustration. Instead, he came to see it as a fundamental drive with its own purpose: the pursuit of destruction. This aggressive energy demands an outlet, whether it be through acts of violence against others or through self-inflicted harm. War, cruelty, and sadistic acts all reflect this destructive impulse projected outward. When turned inward, however, the same energy can fuel depression, self-loathing, overwhelming guilt, and even suicidal ideation. Those who struggle with persistent self-criticism, disordered eating, substance misuse, or other harmful patterns may be unconsciously enacting this internalized death drive. It can also take subtler forms, expressed in chronic pessimism, a cynical worldview, or a habitual focus on the negative, while ignoring opportunities for joy or hope. Recognizing aggression as an autonomous drive rather than merely a reaction to environmental factors carries significant implications for therapeutic approaches and societal interventions. One of the most perplexing aspects of the death drive is the repetition compulsion, which appears to contradict the foundational idea that human beings are motivated by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Freud observed that many individuals unconsciously reenact past traumas, not to resolve them, but to relive them. Rather than healing old wounds, they find themselves trapped in cycles of repetition. A woman abandoned by her father, for example, might repeatedly choose partners who ultimately leave her, recreating the original abandonment and emotional devastation. Combat veterans might unconsciously put themselves in dangerous situations that echo the battlefield, even as they consciously wish to escape those memories. Similarly, children who experienced abuse may engage in self-harm or seek out abusive relationships, drawn to what feels familiar, even when it's destructive. This compulsive reenactment serves the death drive's goal of mastering trauma by rendering it predictable and seemingly controllable. Through repetition, the unconscious attempts to transform chaos into order and powerlessness into control. But instead of healing, this cycle often leads to further suffering, reinforcing trauma and blocking the personal growth that comes from moving forward. Freud also identified a conservative tendency in the psyche as another expression of the death drive. While Eros, the life drive, pushes toward growth, complexity, and change, Thanatos exerts an opposing pull toward inertia, regression, and a return to earlier, less differentiated psychological states. This regressive force can be seen in the resistance to personal transformation, the clinging to familiar routines, and a nostalgic longing for a past perceived as simpler or safer. Individuals who remain locked in self-destructive patterns, even while consciously desiring change, may be caught in the death drive's grip. Their resistance stems not from a lack of will, but from an unconscious pull toward the psychological stasis that change would disrupt. The death drive represents an unconscious impulse to dissolve tension and conflict by removing the inner mechanisms that generate psychological complexity. In its most extreme expressions, this drive can lead to regression into early developmental stages where personal responsibility and deliberate choice are no longer required. The lure of substances like drugs and alcohol often reflects this drive's aim, a desire to retreat from the stress and strain of conscious life. Even seemingly benign practices like sleep and meditation can serve the same function when they are employed not for renewal or mental clarity, but as a way to avoid confronting emotional conflict or existential discomfort. At the core of psychological life lies a constant interplay between the life drive and the death drive, two fundamental forces that generate inner tension and dynamism. Freud did not see these drives as enemies locked in a zero-sum battle. Instead, he recognized that both are essential and inevitable components of human experience. True psychological growth emerges not through the eradication of one drive in favor of the other, but through establishing a flexible, adaptive equilibrium between creative and destructive tendencies. When the life drive dominates unchecked, it can result in manic states, reckless behavior, and blind optimism that ignores realistic limitations and risks. On the other hand, When the death drive gains excessive control, it can manifest as apathy, depression, withdrawal, and a failure to engage meaningfully with the world. Emotional maturity lies in learning to channel both types of energy in ways that are constructive. The death drive, when properly integrated, supports healthy endings, acceptance of limitations, and the capacity to release attachments that hinder personal growth. Meanwhile, the life drive motivates us toward innovation, emotional intimacy, and the bravery required to take creative or social risks that promote development. In this context, sublimation becomes especially important as a way to redirect the raw forces of both drives into activities that benefit society while offering personal satisfaction. It is through sublimation that individuals convert primal impulses into refined actions. For instance, competitive sports provide an outlet for aggressive death drive energy in a controlled environment that fosters discipline and entertains without serious harm. Similarly, scientific inquiry channels both the curiosity of the life drive and the analytical dismantling tendencies of the death drive, enabling progress in knowledge and technology. Artistic endeavors also embody this synthesis, merging the life drive's creative construction with the death drive's disruption of existing norms to forge new cultural expressions that enrich collective experience. Even the field of surgery exemplifies this integration. The life drive's aim to heal coexists with the death drive's function of cutting away diseased tissue. Effective sublimation demands a certain level of psychological development that allows raw instinctual drives to be transformed into sophisticated cultural contributions that fulfill both individual needs and societal advancement. Freud believed that the very survival of civilization hinges on humanity's capacity to refine and expand sublimation mechanisms, channeling destructive urges into productive, socially meaningful actions. The implications of the life and death drive theory extend far beyond individual psychology, offering deep insight into broader social dynamics. Psychological disorders often stem from a disruption in the balance between these primal forces. Depression may arise when death drive energies overpower life-affirming impulses, resulting in emotional paralysis and disconnection from purposeful living. Conversely, manic states can reflect an excessive surge of life drive energy, fueling impulsivity and overconfidence untempered by critical awareness. Recognizing these dynamics helps psychoanalysts shape therapeutic approaches that aim to restore internal balance, rather than merely suppress symptoms. On a societal scale, these drives offer a lens for understanding large-scale destructive events, such as war, revolution, and collective violence, as expressions of unchecked death drive energy. Freud grew increasingly troubled by the ways in which technological progress had magnified humanity's potential for destruction without fostering the psychological maturity needed to manage that power. His dual drive theory thus became a cornerstone of his later, more pessimistic view of humanity's trajectory, alongside his urgent calls for deeper psychological insight to help avert global self-destruction. His dual drive theory thus became a cornerstone of his later, more pessimistic view of humanity's trajectory, alongside his urgent calls for deeper psychological insight to help avert global self-destruction. His dual drive theory thus became a cornerstone of his later, more pessimistic view of humanity's trajectory, alongside his urgent calls for deeper psychological insight to help avert global self-destruction.